A cold winter blanketed the small town with fluffy snow. The local tavern, as usual, was welcoming customers from early morning. Lately, strange rumors have been circulating around the city. They say that some madman is walking across the battlefield. He's most likely a mercenary with lifeless eyes because as soon as the battle ends, he disappears and goes in search of a new one. A mercenary unattached to life. And this madman keeps saying, "I survived again." They also say he always shows up in battles somehow connected to the Empire. He seems driven by something more personal than money. He's most likely the prince of some ruined kingdom, looking for a place to die. During one of these battles, he was driven to a dead end. He was already exhausted because, faced with yet another setback, he attempted to take his own life. But he failed. It was the third prince of Briel, Yuri Briel, a dishonest man who destroyed the kingdom with his own hands. 10 years ago, a casino. It was night outside, and games were in full swing inside. The third prince of Briel, Yuri, who was only 18 years old at the time, was also having fun there. He was accompanied by the royal magician, Hernando. The blonde man was amazed at how the gentleman managed to win every time, and by a small margin at that. Rubbing his hands, Yuri suggested that his fellow players play another round. But this time he doubles down because, under the influence of alcohol and past victories, he got into a gambling frenzy. Hernando whispered to him that it was time to leave. If they stayed here too long, they would be late for the meeting. One of the prince's fellow players kicked the table and agreed with the young man's suggestion that they leave before a scandal started. They know the prince was cheating. He couldn't have been so lucky. Yuri rose from the table, indignant. He was an honorable man. How could he be accused of cheating? The men looked at the young man appraisingly and said that, judging by his behavior, he was not a nobleman, but a member of the royal family. Another useless prince who's getting on the empire's nerves by escalating tensions in the war. All princes are the same. Yuri was furious at these insults and overturned the table in his rage. What do people who only know how to swing a sword know anyway? The prince's abrupt movements frightened his fellow players, and they nervously retreated back. Yuri flexed his fists and introduced himself. As the third prince of Briel, he couldn't allow himself to be treated this way. The guy said with a smile that they wouldn't leave the casino safe today, but his voice was filled with danger and anger. The swordsmen were frightened and retreated even further, but it was too late. There was no point in angering the hot-tempered prince. Because of this fight, the prince was late for a meeting with the girl and lied to her that he was delayed because his father had an urgent conference. The princess of the empire, Katerina Ivarna Granzian, with whom he spoke, did not believe a single word he said. Does he really think he's the only one who can find the time? Does he even realize how long it took her to get here, avoiding the gazes of passers-by? The guy said he understood perfectly well, but his father wasn't at his post right now, so he should be careful. In fact, he shouldn't have told anyone about this. Hearing this, Katerina became indignant. Was she really nobody to him, that he couldn't share this with her either? And Yuri quickly began to make excuses, so as not to draw even more anger from the girl, but it was too late. Katerina threw the amulet he had given her on the ground and said that since he didn't trust her, he might as well not have told her anything at all. She was tired of his constant lies. Katerina turned her back on him and told him, as a parting word, that he should never speak to her again without permission. The guy tried to stop her, but the princess did not turn around and proudly walked away. Yuri thoughtfully picked up the discarded amulet and sighed heavily. What should he do now? This time, making amends with the girl would be much more difficult. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't even notice that he was being watched from around the corner. From that day on, their relationship deteriorated even further. Ties between Briol and the Empire reached breaking point. The Empire's actions were merely a simple provocation, which gradually began to escalate. As a result, the conflict between the countries began to escalate, until it got to the point where there was an invasion. The Empire invaded the lands of Briol. In a matter of hours, they had made their way to the royal castle and set it on fire. The destructive fire engulfed the walls with lightning speed. An urgent evacuation was announced, and all the people who were in the castle began to run, in all directions. Yuri stopped before the entrance to the estate, blazing with a bright flame, and froze. The official war with the Empire had begun. After the passage of eras and countless victims, a war began that seemed to never end. Yuri saw with his own eyes how his older brother Joshua died in battle. Everything could have turned out differently if the war had involved the most powerful force in Briel and the one people called the strongest on the continent, Fior Briel, Yuri's father. Only because of one man's absence did the tide of war gradually turn in the Empire's favor. At first, Yuri thought it was just a coincidence. Perhaps he was simply denying a reality he didn't believe in. However, thoughts of past battles and his rational thinking led him to one conclusion. Katerina betrayed them because she was the only one the guy told everything to. The moment the elder Briol left his estates, the ruthless invasions of the Empire began. Yuri hoped that this strange set of circumstances would ultimately turn out to be just a coincidence. But the response to the letter he'd barely managed to send to Katerina was nothing but disappointment. A letter containing one word. Sorry, Yuri was the last surviving member of the Briol dynasty. Therefore, on the battlefield, all attention was focused on finishing him off. The guy fought bravely with everyone who attacked him and wielded the sword quite skillfully. He could not allow himself to be killed and the Briol dynasty to finally fall. In one of the battles, he also desperately fought for his life, killing the attacking enemies. But there were too many of them for the guy to handle alone. Behind the brunette stood a whole squad of mercenaries with swords sharpened to his head. His feet felt rooted to the ground and his insides went cold. Damn, this is how it's all going to end. One of the mercenaries attacked him with a weapon, and Yuri was able to dodge the blow. But the man knocked the sword out of his hands, leaving the prince unarmed. And without a sword on the battlefield, you're like a walking dead man. Yuri was already ready to accept his death, when suddenly a fair-haired guy jumped out right in front of him and shielded the prince from the enemy's sword. It was Roland, a man who played no small role in the life of young Briol. Before the light in Roland's eyes faded, he whispered a plea to Yuri to save her highness. Then he collapsed to the ground and stopped breathing. Yuri's first reaction was the desire to rush to Roland, pick him up, help him. Suddenly there was still a chance to save his life. But the other warriors, seeing this, stopped him and said that it was not worth doing. His highness needed to flee to save himself. And Yuri had to turn around and run away wherever his eyes looked, because if he died, the kingdom of Briol would finally fall. All night and throughout the following days, rumors of the prince's escape continued in the enemy camp. All efforts were focused on finding him. Yuri was able to take cover for a while in the enemy warehouse, among the chests and boxes. But he couldn't hide there forever. He must somehow miraculously break through them and come up with something. I wonder what happened to his father. Considering he still hasn't returned, he was most likely killed before entering the kingdom. While he was pondering these thoughts, the doors to the warehouse opened for the first time. The prince's heart sank in his chest. It was the enemy commander. He pacified the boy with a calm, unreadable gaze. Yuri begged him for mercy. He couldn't die here like this. If he dies here, Briol will no longer be able to resist. The deaths of so many knights who sacrificed themselves for him will be in vain. Contrary to the prince's greatest fears, the commander did not kill him, but even apologized. He didn't go into detail explaining his position, merely saying that the Empire would be punished for its sins. Empire soldiers would soon burst into the warehouse, so the man advised the brunette to leave quickly. It didn't take much convincing. He immediately ran out into the street and spent the entire day running through the forest as fast as his strength allowed. However, all this was nothing more than childish bravado. But reality turned out to be cruel. In the end, everyone died. What was the point of all this bloodshed? Yuri can't even think of a reason for it. So yes, as an adult he became a mercenary and took up a sword only to punish himself, with the hope that one day someone will appear who can kill him and free him from his torment and endless feelings of guilt. That's why Yuri found himself on a snowy battlefield 10 years later, exhausted, with a stab wound in his stomach, and a dark night standing before him. The enemy was only amused by the whole situation. Just think, the brunette, for some reason, was rushing into the most dangerous fights only to lose. And all he could come up with, despite numerous failures, was to kill himself. Death was too good an end for someone like him. Yuri tensed. The man not only knew his name, but also every detail of his biography. But everyone who knew his past was long dead. The knight lifted his helmet. He angrily muttered that everything that had happened to the fallen kingdom of Briol was Yuri's fault. He alone was to blame for everything. When the boy lifted his helmet fully, the prince saw a familiar face. It was Roland, but not as before. His face was scarred and his eyes glowed red. But he died then, in the midst of the war, when he defended the third prince of Briol. Roland said that the reason Briol fell at the hands of the Empire was because of the oath of honor of the Flandre family, which had served the royal family all this time. Because of this, Roland's dignity and faith collapsed overnight. Roland stabbed his old acquaintance in the chest with his sword, and he choked on his blood. The one who had long been dead returned as a ghost and punished him for his sins. Yuri thought that he would feel better when he died and finally got rid of this burden, this heavy feeling of guilt. It does not go away, even when Yuri takes his last breaths, and the amulet that reminds him of his greatest mistake falls. Guilt weighs on him even in the final moments of his life. Everything slowly fades before his eyes, and the young man's consciousness sinks into oblivion. Yuri cannot say how much time he spent in endless darkness, where there is no sound or light. But when he woke up, he suddenly found himself in a soft bed. His worried father leaned over him. The man said his son hadn't opened his eyes for 3 days. Yuri sat up in bed, rubbing the back of his head in confusion. Father? Where is he anyway? How can his dead father be sitting right in front of him? The boy bowed his head sadly and thought he'd gone to hell after death. He wondered out loud that his father had too. The man asked his son, confused, what exactly he meant. Then he took his father's hand and repeated that he was surprised his father had ended up in hell. For a man who constantly talked about honor, he lived a very tolerable life. Suddenly, the father hit his son on the back of the head so hard that he nearly doubled over. He asked what kind of nonsense the younger boy was talking about. Yuri still hasn't gotten it. He's angry that his father, even in hell, can't break this habit of his and ordered him to apologize. But suddenly a light green leaf, driven by the wind, flew past the younger boy's face. He watched with his gaze as the leaf flew across the room and out the open window, outside which the sun was shining brightly and the trees were green. Only then did Yuri realize that he was not in hell at all. Outside the window, a fountain roared and birds sang. Yuri was in his own, still intact kingdom, in his old room. The servants were laughing and working in the yard. Everything was normal. Everyone was alive. If after death he found himself in hell, he would see sinners outside the window in the terrifying flame of purification. The devil must torment him and mock him for all the mistakes he made, for the life he wasted, for the fact that he let down his kingdom. But none of this happened. Instead, Yuri saw his father and older brothers alive next to him. Everything started swimming before my eyes. My head started spinning at a terrifying speed. The boy fainted from what he saw and fell into a deep sleep again. He was still the same Yuri Briol, but at that moment he was no longer 28 or even 18 years old, but only 13. As expected, at first Yuri thought it was a dream or a long-lasting memory. But it doesn't matter how hard he tried. He was unable to wake up or see the end of the world. Instead, old memories lying in the recesses of his memory were constantly repeated. Then there was only one option left for what could have happened to him. Yuri couldn't help but admit that he'd returned to the past. To the spring of the year he'd turned 13. He'd been given another chance. Early morning. A maid entered the young prince's room and opened the curtains wide, letting in sunlight. She woke up the boy because the previous evening he had asked to be woken up early in the morning. It's time to practice swordsmanship. Hearing this, Yuri immediately opened his sleepy eyes. He immediately jumped up in bed, and the last vestiges of sleep vanished as if by magic. He began to take off his pajamas and, stammering with excitement, asked Ina, that was the name of the maid, to quickly give him his shower clothes. The girl approached him and politely asked him to calm down and not worry so much. First, she'll help him wash his face. There's no rush. They have plenty of time before practice. The boy froze in fear, looking at the girl because memories of the bloody death of his subordinate during the war flashed before his eyes. Yuri tried to pull himself together and completely unexpectedly asked Ina to give him 3 hearty slaps. For the servants, such actions were tantamount to committing treason. But Yuri said that nothing would happen since he himself asked for it. Then Ina fulfilled his request and pressed her palm firmly against his cheek 3 times. Yuri had forgotten that the girl was so strong. Asking her wasn't the best idea. But he was convinced that everything that was happening to him wasn't a dream. He pulled himself together and showed up for training, even though his cheek was still burning from the hard slaps. The other people involved just laughed at him for his injury, and no one even offered to apply any ointment. Even Bernard, his personal sword trainer, said nothing about his sore cheek. The training began, and Yuri realized for the first time that Bernard always simply sparred with him, but didn't even point out his mistakes. He hadn't noticed it before because he was young and didn't think about it. When did Bernard start simply sparring with him? The answer lay in a private conversation between Bernard and King Briol. The trainer told his father that the boy was good when it came to intellect, but not in combat. If the prince had been a little more sincere, he would have been a blessing for Briol. Yuri recalled even overhearing this conversation. From that moment on, Bernard stopped making any effort to educate the young prince. They started sparring because they couldn't agree on anything during training. Bernard realized that Yuri had become increasingly lazy and didn't want to go to training at all, so he stopped trying to reach the young man. But this can't go on. Suddenly, Yuri stopped and told Bernard that from now on, the man would teach him properly. And he vowed that from that moment on, he would train correctly and listen to his mentor in everything. Bernard was pleased with this proposal. Whatever came over the young gentleman, he would fulfill his request. From this moment on, the real training began, and just by the look on the coach's face, one could tell that it definitely wasn't going to be easy. Bernard, like a cheetah, ran at great speed towards the student and their swords crossed. Yuri was able to withstand this short blow, and Bernard jumped to the side, still remaining in an attacking position. The boy swallowed hard. He had already forgotten how strong his master was. Before coming to work as a trainer at the Briol estate, he had a brilliant reputation. He was known throughout the kingdom and beyond as the Sword Demon. Yuri cringed in fear, noticing that the trainer had also activated his mana flow, preparing for a strike. The training promised to be tough, and so it happened, but the brunette held out with dignity until the very end. Yuri thought that if he hadn't been a mercenary in his past life, he wouldn't have survived at all. Even though Bernard's training is incredibly tiring, his abilities will improve much faster this way, right? So he needs to keep trying. Bernard couldn't help but admit that Yuri had done well in training. He'd repelled all of his attacks. Where had the prince improved so much? Suddenly, Ina ran into the arena. She told His Highness it was time to stop training and leave, because the king was requesting his presence. Yuri was surprised and asked why his father needed him. Ina said that apparently Count Johannes brought his son, the same age as Yuri. The boy remembered him from his past life, that he was the man who betrayed the kingdom and gave the empire a chance. His name is Got Bavar, and in the past he happily led one of the empire's detachments. Yuri's mood worsened significantly. He wasn't about to stand on ceremony with a traitor in this life, so he sternly asked Ina where the idiot was now. The Briol family and their invited guests met together a little later in the dining room. Count Johannes looked at the third prince of Briol in fascination and noticed that he had changed quite a lot. He has become much smarter and more obedient, which is definitely pleasing. Yuri's father, as always, remained cold. So instead of acknowledging the changes in his son, he assumed that he had simply taken the wrong pills. The count laughed it off and said that then he wanted to give these pills to his son too, since God had room to grow. Meanwhile, the count's little son looked at Briol's eldest son with great admiration, because he always looked up to him. But the younger man's menacing gaze made him feel awkward and tense. The middle brother nudged Yuri on the shoulder and asked if he and the count's son had had a fight. The boy answered in the affirmative, still frowning. This really amused the brother. And what would their powerful younger Briol do then? Yuri didn't answer. His thoughts focused on his opponent. Got looked normal, but in reality, he was currently thinking about how to match the mood of the others. Now, as in the past when he was older, the boy has not changed at all. Unable to withstand the uncomfortable gaze, Got also glared back angrily, hoping that at least after this Yuri would stop pressuring him. And Yuri truly pulled himself together. This life would not follow the same shameful path as the past. Come to think of it, around this time in his past life, he had a fight with Got. Did he decide to betray Briol because he'd been resentful of the prince since that day? In this life, Yuri decided to act a little differently. After dinner, he challenged the younger Johannes to a duel in the courtyard. Instead of swords, they armed themselves with thick sticks. Yuri told his peer that the kingdom had no use for weak-willed knights, so he wanted to test him. Although he is not an official knight at the moment, he will become one in the future and will serve the kingdom. Got barely had time to hesitantly agree with this when the young gentleman announced the start of the duel and, without a second's hesitation, attacked his opponent. The boy managed to block the blow and told his opponent that a surprise attack was very cowardly. Then Yuri jumped back and slammed his foot hard into the sand, and it flew straight into his opponent's face. Sand got into Got's eyes, causing him to become confused. Wiping his eyes, he asked the prince to fight the noble battle, not like this. Then Yuri threw the stick aside and decided that he would continue fighting without any weapons. Smiling slyly, he ran up to his opponent, confident that victory was already in his pocket. With a deft kick, he very carefully knocked the stick out of the boy's hands and knocked him to the ground. Then he raised the enemy's sword and pinned him to the ground. In his past life, Got Bavar had used his honor as a count to sell information to the empire. Of course he did it to survive, but this time Yuri will make sure that Got will stand firmly on the soil of Briol. Yuri told the boy that his father was a magnificent count and a worthy knight. He asked him why he thought his father had received all these titles. God admitted he didn't quite understand what Yuri meant. Then the brunette extended his hand. In this life, Yuri will not allow dissent from any knight, not even himself. Then he asked the boy another, paraphrased question. Why did God's father become a count? Who gave him this title? Yuri didn't wait for an answer. God grabbed his hand, and the boy helped him up. Yuri advised his friend to think about what he had said today. God continued to be wary of the prince, but it was clear that his words had planted a seed of reflection within the count's son. After Bakvar left, his brother praised Yuri for his inspiring speech. The younger boy really was a good fighter. He thought that Yuri would lose, but it turned out more exciting than he expected. Yuri, a little offended by the fact that his brother didn't believe in him, shook himself off and asked if he even knew who he was. The elder replied that Yuri was the worst blockhead and swindler that had ever existed in the kingdom. The boy frowned and said seriously that he wasn't like that anymore, and the older one should stop causing problems too. The brother was confused. Did he hit his head? Or had he really decided to change? Yuri smiled at him radiantly, because his intentions to improve were completely sincere. After this conversation, the boy went to another sword training session and stayed there until the evening, until the sky began to darken. Bernard praised the student for his good work and suggested they finish it for today. But he has something else he wants to tell the prince. He thinks that Yuri is already ready to learn about the method of mana control. The boy, who had been completely exhausted up to this point, suddenly rose from the ground and asked if the coach was really going to teach him this. Bernard said that, unfortunately, he wouldn't be the one teaching. His method was too weak, given the boy's potential. He needed to learn the Briol method. In his past life, Yuri had learned this method and was able to master it. But there was one technique that he had not even tried to learn in the past. Bernard noticed the young prince's hesitation and asked if he was thinking of learning some other method. Yuri confirmed this and asked his superior to recommend him a knight based on his potential, not his skills. The coach thought for a moment, going through all possible options. He said that if he based his answer solely on potential, Gerald would definitely be a good match for the boy. Yuri asked if Bernard was absolutely sure of his conclusions, and he confirmed it with confidence. Yuri paused. He hadn't expected to hear this particular knight's name. Before the regression, he met Gerald only towards the end of the war. He had quite good skills, but Yuri was surprised that the knight was able to survive for so long with them. His potential was truly special, but he didn't hone it. At the same time, he was very angry precisely because he could have been much stronger if he had trained more. However, by the time the war began, this no longer made any sense. Even on the battlefield, they were both still stupid. Be that as it may, the boy decided to trust the coach and headed to the training hall inside the palace, since the elders were still training. Gerald stood next to the other students, preparing for a practice duel. Up on the balcony stood a young teacher, watching the training of the young knights. Suddenly, the door to the balcony opened and the quiet creak of the hinges attracted the man's attention. Yuri popped his head inside and waved hello. He said he'd come to see how things were going. The coach smiled and said they were always happy to see His Highness. Preparations were in full swing, and they were working hard. Yuri looked down from the balcony at the knights' training duels and noticed that they all looked quite enthusiastic. The boy asked him where Gerald was among them. The man pointed to the newcomer in the distance. Then Yuri finally noticed him in the crowd, but was not particularly pleased with his fighting style. Now he understood what Bernard was talking about. Training should be based on the desire to improve one's skills, and he was simply doing exactly as much as necessary. Yuri has already said out loud that at this rate, the talented newcomer will soon lose his position. The boy asked Sir Rosso, the teacher, to bring the prince a wooden sword. He wanted to join the sparring. Rosso didn't mind, so Yuri pointed his finger at Gerald and said that he wanted to fight him. The trainer arranged this battle for him without even asking any additional questions. All the other knights sat down on the ground around them. Gerald's comrades teased him, motivating him to take this battle seriously and giving him all sorts of advice. Gerald sighed heavily and rolled his eyes. Fighting a minor was like bullying to him. Yuri, however, was inspired by the fight. He said that Gerald, according to rumors, was quite talented and asked the older man not to give in to him because of his age. The guy hesitantly promised him this, but there was no sincerity in his words. Either way, Yuri enthusiastically rushed into battle, hoping that Gerald would keep his word. Gerald parried his attack with the utmost ease, as expected. His comrades weren't surprised at all either. The young man always fights without making unnecessary movements, just like this time. But Yuri continued to persistently attack the brown-haired man, and then he felt a slight difficulty. His comrades also noticed that His Highness was quite good, After only half a minute, Gerald had to put in a little more effort to keep up with the speed of the younger man's blows. The boy's movements are so unnaturally consistent. For his age, this style of swordsmanship is very unusual. It was also noticeable that Yuri fought without even feeling any difficulties. For him, this fight was like a game. It's as if he could attack even faster and more brutally, but he deliberately adjusts to Gerald's pace. Yuri was pleased to note that Gerald had finally realized that the younger one was giving in to him, and said that fighting like that was no fun at all. Therefore, at that very moment he sped up so much that Gerald barely had time to block the blows, and said that now he would fight seriously. Despite the most unexpected attack, the opponent still blocked the prince's sword. As expected, he has feral reflexes. The young prince's next swing of the sword was so swift that the boy had to jump back to avoid being hit. He wanted to gradually increase the pace in order to conserve his strength and defeat the younger one, but now he needed to come up with a new strategy. Gerald irritably parried another powerful blow from the younger man's sword, increasing the distance between them. This was the first time in the entire fight that Yuri lost his head and fought back purely on instinct. Even considering Yuri's past, Gerald is still a very good knight. The boy thought he could defeat him, but now he doubted it. And yet, he must hit the opponent at least once. So he ducked and deftly slipped under the brown-haired man's arm. At the same time, he gave him a strong blow to the ribs with his wooden sword. Yuri stopped and rejoiced in his success. There it was. The other knights supported his highness and praised him for his excellent strike. They hadn't imagined he could make a good match for the best newcomer. The intensity of the fight only heightened Yuri's interest. He noted with a smile that his opponent wasn't exactly being lenient with him. Gerald is tense. It's so strange he's attacking, but it feels like he's the one being cornered. At that moment, Yuri came closer and swung his sword so close to the guy's neck that he almost missed the blow. Yuri swung his sword again. What a shame. He'd been so eager to catch the older man. Gerald then decided he'd had enough of this bullying, so he didn't hesitate to resort to mana. The comrades watching him were seriously frightened and tried to stop him. Had he gone crazy? Using mana control against a little boy? He could even accidentally kill him that way. Yuri barely managed to dodge the lunge that Gerald made in his direction with a red-hot sword. Several strands of the prince's hair fell to the ground. He dodged the blow, but at the very last second, so the blade of the sword cut off part of his bangs. Gerald was so frightened he nearly had a heart attack. He was so angry that he had clearly overstepped his bounds. The knight's companions turned to his highness and asked if he had suffered too much from this madman. Yuri calmed them down and said everything was fine. Just a minor scratch. Had they never seen a live sparring match before? Yuri put a bandage on his head to cover the scratch and told Gerald to raise his sword. Now, it will be really fun to fight since they will both be using their full strength. Their swords clashed again with such zeal that sparks flew in all directions. Yuri got into the swing of things and rained down attacks at incredible speed, while Gerald took a defensive position and repelled all the blows. During the fight, Gerald noticed that the prince was different from him. His eyes were shining with interest and strength, and he delivered blows with insane speed, paying no attention to the approaching fatigue. The prince pushes himself to the limit, even during a simple training fight. This intrigued the boy. Why was he so passionate about the battle, giving his all? The opponents clashed once again. A mere 10 centimeters remained between their faces, separated only by their blades. The fight was so intense and interesting that Gerald's blood seemed to boil. He had never felt this way, even when he sparred with stronger opponents. He was intrigued by the boy's burning eyes, which thirsted for victory at any cost, even though no reward awaited him in the final. This young prince made some feeling grow inside him. Gerald almost missed a very important blow to himself, which only fueled his desire to continue the fight, and he attacked the guy in return. So hard that Yuri's sword suddenly became covered in cracks, and then it completely fell apart into pieces and scattered in different directions. Yuri wasn't even the least bit upset by his defeat. He breathed a sigh of relief and said that it was the end. He extended his hand to his partner and thanked him for a good fight. Gerald shook it and praised the persistent boy in return. Yuri displayed a determination and persistence he'd never seen before. How could such a young prince be so wise? The boy looked at his opponent in confusion, not understanding why he was looking at him so closely. Yuri did not remain silent and asked him what he was doing. Why does he silently look at his bandage and continue shaking his hand? Because of him, the prince started bleeding, and he stands here as if nothing happened. Gerald immediately turned and ran to the doctor to call him for the prince. But the boy didn't have time to tell him he was just joking. When the knight fled, Yuri fell wearily to the ground, breathing heavily. This fight had been difficult, especially after his basic training. But now he had admirers among the knights. They stood on the balcony and shouted his praises. His Highness was magnificent. At that moment, another man, the captain of the Knights of Briol Send, climbed up onto the balcony. The knights immediately stepped aside and made way for him. The man looked thoughtfully at the young gentleman. A few days after that situation in the training room, Gerald strolled through the castle courtyard, slowly passing the large central fountain. Then someone caught up with him and asked if his shift was over yet. It was Yuri. He was standing nearby, leaning against a tall column. He had been waiting specifically for his acquaintance. The prince ran up to him and strode confidently ahead, beckoning the boy to join him. They needed to go somewhere together. Gerald said that he couldn't just run away like that. He needed to train. To which the younger one said that the guy only took up training thanks to him. So once, for the sake of an important matter, he can afford to distract the knight from his studies. Yuri thought to himself with joy that now the brown-haired man was really putting effort into self-improvement. Unlike in the past, Gerald asked where they were going, but the boy did not answer and ordered him to follow him silently. And he promised that there would be nothing dangerous there, especially since there was another man with them. He arrived at the meeting place just in time. Yuri noticed him in the distance and called him over, drawing his attention to himself. The guy didn't notice him right away, but the boy's scream quickly attracted him. The escort the prince spoke of turned out to be Briola's royal magician, Hernando. It turned out he, too, had no idea where the young gentleman was going. But the boy persistently persuaded him to accompany them. Hernando was a little taken aback and said that he actually had some urgent matters to attend to. But Yuri knew what leverage to use. He told Hernando he'd forgive his gambling debt if he went with them. This immediately interested the fair-haired man, and he was ready to put all his plans on hold. The prince smiled and said that as a reward for the task completed, he would forgive the young man everything he had lost to him. Yuri asked the elder if he had ever cheated him. Hernando sighed heavily and said that outside the gambling house, no. The joyful prince nodded his head, pleased with his reputation. Exactly, but he relaxed too soon. Hernando actually meant that he rarely saw the prince outside the gambling house. Yuri remembered with sadness that this had indeed been true in his past life. Regardless, he was truly willing to forgive Hernando the full amount of his debt. The boy reluctantly agreed, but said he couldn't take the prince's word for it. So he took a form out of his inside pocket and asked the boy to confirm his promise in writing. Yuri looked at him wearily. What was going on? Did his reputation really get that bad? So what are the words of the young Prince Briol worth at this moment? Yuri agreed and said that Gerald would vouch for him, so there was no need to give written testimony. At first, Gerald didn't quite understand what they wanted from him, but then, reluctantly, he agreed. This suited Hernando, and he finally agreed to go on the journey, so he gave the younger man the leading role. The only thing that bothered him was the fact that the prince was going to some unknown place where he would need the protection of a knight and a magician. Yuri confessed to them that he was going to go to the Sword Mountain. From now on, they are going to rob the dungeon of the progenitor. The boys weren't thrilled with the idea, but they had already agreed. So together they went down into the dark, damp dungeon beneath the palace. These were secret passages that stretched from the castle to various places in the kingdom. Until then, the boys had no idea they had such a place. Gerald, who was walking ahead with a torch, asked the young gentleman what was at the end of this cave. Yuri replied that the passage led directly to the Mountain of Swords. In the knight's mind, this was a place where only legends about the founder remained. Yuri nodded his head thoughtfully, confirming that this was indeed the case. In his past life, after Briol was captured by the Empire, they found a dungeon hidden inside the Sword Mountain. There they found a hidden relic. It turned out to be a legacy from Briol's founder. They made a big splash with the news. However, this passage was simply a desperate escape route for Yuri. Because of this, he was unable to claim Briol's legacy before the Empire did. But now, in comparison to the past, when he was just running away, the boy is tirelessly moving forward, not towards the past, but towards a bright future. Therefore, in this life, he will see everything for himself and learn what legacy his ancestors left behind. The long journey through the dungeon ended after some time, and the exit from it turned out to be under the forest. Having reached the end, they opened the large stone gates and came out right on the Mountain of the Sword, among the unexplored thickets. They looked around carefully, but saw nothing but a dense, quiet forest around. Hernando asked the young gentleman where they would get the key to the secret door he had spoken of. Yuri knew, but he wasn't about to answer. The key was lying in the corner, just like in his past life. Back then, he hadn't known what it was for, and he paid for it. While making his way through the thicket, the magician accidentally touched one of the thorny branches of a small tree with his hand and scratched his hand. The boy advised him to be careful. There were sharp leaves and branches here. So the boys would be better off just following him and trying not to get hurt. Yuri confidently moved forward through the forest, and his companions watched him with interest and incomprehension. Having fallen a little behind the prince, Hernando decided to ask Sir Gerald a question. Maybe something's happened to the prince lately. Maybe he ate something bad or hit his head. He's been acting really weird. The knight said that he had noticed this too, but Yuri did not allow them to continue the discussion because he scolded them for being slow. Just as his companions caught up with him, Yuri stopped them. He himself froze in front of a bush, lowering his voice. Ahead of them, in the clearing, was a pack of terrible, hungry wolves. The team took cover behind the bushes, and then Yuri told his comrades that the wolves were moving in groups. There were likely even more of them here than were visible from here. When Gerald asked Yuri how he knew this, the boy said that he read it in a book. Hernando was stunned. He read that in a book? Another oddity, completely out of character for their prince. Yuri pretended not to notice or be offended by his surprise, and said the wolves seemed to have missed them. They needed to quickly pass by, but they didn't even have time to come out from behind the bushes because Hernando completely carelessly stepped on a branch, and it made a dull crunch under his foot. Hernando chuckled awkwardly, knowing full well that this mistake was fraught with dire consequences. He had barely managed to utter an apology when a ferocious wolf pounced on him from behind the bushes. Gerald immediately ran up to him, drawing a heavy sword from its sheath. Luckily, he managed to cut the animal's neck before it could sink its teeth into the magician's flesh. The heavy body fell at Hernando's feet, and he flinched in fear. Yuri noticed that Gerald, knowing the dire wolf's fur was quite rough, had used mana control. He praised the boy for it. But now the leader of the wolves has set his sights on the boys and will definitely want to avenge his fellow wolf. He howled, calling his subordinates for help. And at that very moment, more than a dozen bloodthirsty wolves ran into the clearing. Gerald covered his comrades with his body and ordered them not to go far so that he could protect them. The animals did not wait for the people to be ready for battle and pounced on the knight, spraying viscous saliva. Gerald sharpened his sword with his mana and cut off one of the wolves' furry head. Both Hernando and Yuri acknowledged that the boy was quite gifted and that they were lucky to have such a strong swordsman protecting them. But he still had a lot to learn, especially since the wolves greatly outnumbered him. Therefore, soon he was having difficulty repelling their attacks, and the intervention of his comrades was necessary. It's time for Hernando to show off his abilities, which their king so believes in. After all, Hernando is a battle mage. In a matter of seconds, thanks to his magical power, he ignited a hot flame around himself. Gerald, fighting off another wolf, suddenly felt his back feel hot, and when he turned around he saw that a huge fireball was flying straight at them. He struck the wolf across the mouth with his sword to disorient it and prevent it from escaping. He jumped to the side so the projectile flew and hit only the animal. The battle continued until the evening. As with every attempt to move further through the forest, the boys came across new monsters. Because of this, they were greatly delayed, but finally reached their destination. They found themselves at the summit of Sword Mountain. A sharp cliff plunged far below. The treetops in their hometown lay beneath their feet, but there was no time to admire the views. Gerald asked the boy if they were really there. There was nothing here, let alone any kind of heritage. Yuri told him that he was absolutely sure that they were in the right place. They just needed to find the entrance. And at that moment, his gaze fell on a small, sparkling stone that was hiding between the black boulders. Yuri fell to his knees and told his escorts that they needed to get this thing out of the ground. Hernando complained and said that magicians should not get their hands dirty, but he helped anyway. What they unearthed turned out to be a sword, and the glowing stone was an ornament to the weapon's hilt. Yuri trembled as he grasped the hilt with his palm and lifted the dusty sword from the pit. It turned out to be quite sharp and long. Very good work. It certainly serves well in combat. Hernando looked at it and said that the sword looked new. It didn't look like it had been buried for a long time. Closer to the hilt, on the blade, was engraved the name of the man to whom this sword once belonged. The culprit. Yuri said that he was not entirely sure that this sword was the legacy of the founders. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook and continued to tremble, as if a strong earthquake had occurred. But Yuri wasn't afraid. He smiled and announced that now they would discover what exactly the founders' legacy was. The rocks beneath their feet began to crumble in part, forming a crevice, until the floor beneath them collapsed and they fell headfirst into some kind of cave. The place where they found themselves looked like some kind of ancient altar, and at the far end of the cave, there was a huge glowing crystal on a pedestal. Yuri fell on Gerald, so the fall was relatively painless for him, unlike the knight. Luckily, he at least managed to save himself from more pain by protecting his body with mana control. Hernando was able to use magic and, thanks to this, ensure his careful maneuvering all the way to the bottom. Yuri was angry with him because the magician had only protected himself and hadn't thought about him and Gerald at all. But Hernando simply didn't have time to think about it. Suddenly, Hernando noticed a tall, dangerous figure appear at the other end of the hall and pointed it out to the prince. But he thought the magician was simply trying to change the subject. But a menacing aura quickly spread through the cave, and Yuri too sensed danger. The monster's red, ferocious eyes stared at them from the darkness. It was a terrifying ghost in gleaming armor and a torn scarlet cloak. Particles of evil spirits hung in the air around it. Thanks to his knowledge from his past life, Yuri realized that the person in front of them was the Death Knight. The boy ordered Gerald to finally get up from the ground, otherwise he was taking too long to come to his senses. But he didn't react in any way. Then the prince ran up to him and kicked him, causing the knight to immediately come to his senses and fall to the ground. He looked around in fear and asked his comrades in a trembling voice where the hell they were. And then he was overcome with even greater fear when he saw a dead man in plate armor standing before him. He, too, recognized the Death Knight. Even though he was scared himself, Gerald grabbed his sword and shielded the prince, doing his duty. The Death Knight walked slowly towards the boys from the other end of the hall, but stopped a meter away from them. A Death Knight is a knight who has returned from death. If a knight dies and is reborn in this form, they become stronger than they were in life. However, Yuri knew that everything was fine and told his escorts that the dead man was not dangerous. Gerald asked the boy how he understood this, to which Yuri only replied that his instincts told him so. It couldn't be that the knight guarding the ancestors' dungeon would fight him, a man with the same bloodline. But judging by the dead man's appearance, it was hard to tell he was friendly. His lifeless, terrifying eyes bored into the boy, until the knight suddenly grabbed his sword in one deft movement. Hernando and Gerald, scared to death, immediately rushed to save the prince. A sharp blade flashed right in front of his face but didn't touch him. And not even because Yuri dodged. The knight drew his sword from its sheath and tossed it aside. Its tip sank into the stone floor. Hernando, who was standing behind, was afraid that with this movement the guard had cut the prince's head in half. But Yuri, unharmed, turned to him and said everything was fine. Only the blow had caught his bangs, comically cutting them off. The Death Knight looked the boy over carefully and said that he had the same smug demeanor as his ancestor. The boy asked with interest and surprise who exactly he was talking about. The knight replied that Yuri reminded him very much of Eric Briol, which greatly surprised Gerald and Hernando. The boys said it was the name of a man known to every inhabitant of the kingdom. He was a master swordsman who had conquered the entire continent using only one blade. He is also the ancestor of Briol, the land of knights, and its first king. Yuri asked in surprise if he was the first to find this dungeon since his great-great-grandfather had dug it up. The knight said yes. He also added that only a descendant of Briol could lift that sword at the entrance, so he immediately understood who was standing in front of him. Yuri was stunned. He looked at the blade in his hands. So this means that this is the same unrivaled sword that the forefather used? But the knight told him it wasn't Eric's sword, but his. And the boy wasn't exactly upset, but he felt awkward about taking someone else's. Be that as it may, this is not why they gathered here. The dead man asked the descendant of Briol to state the reason why he came here. Yuri introduced himself fully to him, stated his full name and status, and asked him to give him Eric's legacy as a descendant of Briol. The knight didn't answer and turned away from the boy, facing the crystal that was behind them. Since the time has come, perhaps he should complete his mission. He said that he could give the young master what he wanted and led him deeper into the cave. Gerald felt a strange, unpleasant feeling in his chest. This couldn't be happening. They arrived at the dungeon of Briol's forefather and spoke with the Death Knight himself. This wasn't how he'd imagined the life of a royal knight. Noticing that the guy was hesitating, standing in place, Yuri turned to him and asked what he was doing there. When Gerald looked up from his thoughts at the prince, he felt something very strange. A strange fragment flashed before his eyes like an old memory, but Gerald didn't remember anything like it. It was as if he saw a grown prince. The guy scratched his head irritably and thought that it was because of the excitement and lack of air in the cave that he was already seeing all sorts of nonsense. When the unpleasant feeling finally subsided, he followed Yuri. The Death Knight led them further down the passage, and they found themselves right in front of huge blue glowing crystals. The corpse sat down next to them, and suddenly the entire cave was flooded with an even more powerful magical light. Yuri and the boys seemed blinded by it. And when the flow of magical rays finally ended, and Yuri was able to open his eyes, he found himself in the middle of a vast desert. Yuri looked around and noticed that neither Gerald nor Hernando, nor even the Death Knight were nearby. Where was he? There was only burning orange sand and dry rocks around him, but then a strange figure appeared in the distance. Yuri, blinded by the setting sun, couldn't see who stood before him. He cautiously asked the stranger if he was the ancestor. But when the silhouette became clearer and came closer, the boy himself realized that he was wrong. What stood before him was not a human at all. This thing was anatomically human-like, but had no face, no genitals, no other distinguishing features. The monster, armed with a sword, did not say anything to him because it had no mouth, but immediately attacked the boy. The enemy's sword met Yuri's blade and bounced off, showering sparks. Suddenly, Yuri saw a strange blue spot in front of him, which began to spin like a funnel and became larger and larger. A blue magical light emanated from his opponent. The monster used a mana control method and further strengthened both its body and blade. Suddenly, the silhouette stopped, and instead of carrying out a second attack, began to silently gesture and explain something to him. Yuri guessed that this subhuman was showing him the basics of mana control. Having finished his silent explanation, he gestured that he now wanted Yuri to repeat the same thing. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. He asked again if the enemy really wanted him to try this right in the middle of battle. The silhouette nodded. Yuri scratched his head and thought that his ancestor really had been crazy. To train someone in mana control before they even learned it, and during a fight at that. Only someone who is living their second life can do this. Yuri followed his opponent's example and activated the mana core within himself, as he had been shown. He dropped to his knees and transferred the concentration of his power to his right hand. He was able to replicate the energy transfer technique his ancestor had demonstrated to him quite easily. But before Yuri had even finished his practice, he was already picking up his sword again. He admitted he hadn't fully grasped everything yet, but was ready to try it in a real fight. A wide, satisfied, and excited smile suddenly appeared on the faceless man's head. He also took up his sword and prepared to continue the fight. Yuri needs to become stronger. In the near future, the Empire will show its greed and take over Briol. He will do everything possible to destroy them and will not repeat his past mistakes. Yuri focused all his attention on the new blade and imbued it with his mana and power. He bravely rushed back into battle. He would make Eric Briol's sword skills his own. The opponents clashed in a heated battle, and despite the fact that the confrontation was serious and dangerous, both enjoyed the process. Meanwhile, Gerald also gradually regained consciousness, but in a different place. When he opened his eyes, he saw that he was in the training arena at the palace. He carefully touched the scratch on his forehead, which stung slightly. The hall was empty. At least that's what it seemed to him at first glance, because he didn't see anyone in front of him, and there was dead silence all around. The guy pinched himself and, feeling a slight pain, realized that he was definitely not sleeping. Then he realized that he was not in a real training hall, but in a trap, so he ordered his opponent to show himself to him. In response, he heard the sounds of quiet footsteps that echoed behind him. Gerald grabbed his sword and turned around, thinking that his opponent would be the same dead man from the cave. But to his surprise, a man stepped forward who was an exact copy of Gerald. A clone? Was this some kind of test from the Death Knight? The knight asked his clone if his name was also Gerald, or if they only looked alike. But the clone turned out to be his exact copy. He grinned evilly and told the boy not to try to fight fate. Didn't he become a knight to live a comfortable life? He's pursuing his dreams of wealth, so why risk his life? The clone advised him to stay away from the third prince, saying the boy would become unhappy if he continued to fight his fate. Gerald sighed heavily. There was some truth in those words. He had indeed become a knight for selfish reasons, and he would have agreed with his clone if he had remained the same. But lately, he had changed quite a bit. The meeting with the young prince forced him to reconsider his priorities and change his worldview and plans for life. Gerald chuckled. He told the clone all this, but it couldn't understand his thoughts because it wasn't real. Yes, he can't turn back time and prevent what he did. So thoughts about what he used to be only distract him. So why dwell on them? The clone was very unhappy that he was unable to influence his original in any way. So he swung his sword and struck at the original, but it eluded the attack. It turned out to be painfully predictable. Not surprising, since the previous Gerald, who fought only at the bare minimum, was weaker than the current him. The clone uses the sword, focusing it on defense to avoid all kinds of risks. As Yuri had said, the old Gerald really had been boring. Now he realized it. The clone jumped to the side, taking up a defensive position, but the real Gerald fearlessly took the initiative in the fight. He struck the replica with his sword powerfully and hit the fake Gerald's sword, cutting through both his armor and his body. The wounded clone fell to his knees and doubled over in pain. But the worst thing happened when some strange, viscous liquid began to drip from the clone's open wound. In the blink of an eye, the fake Gerald transformed into a huge swamp mud monster that was twice as tall as the knight himself. The second phase of the battle had begun. Gerald, of course, was a little unprepared for this, but he wasn't surprised that he wouldn't get off so easily with just one fight. The size of the monster was truly astonishing, but Gerald promised himself that he could handle it. And he thought that the third prince was probably also in the heat of battle. Mentally, the boy wished his comrades luck in overcoming their trials. Meanwhile, in the endless desert, where the young prince found himself, the fight with the faceless man was interesting, but too difficult for Yuri. So, in the end, he found himself pinned against a rock cliff and almost lost. The tired boy hung his head and breathed heavily, looking at the ground. The faceless one came closer and swung his sword at the exhausted youth one last time. And immediately after that, the entire area was filled with a bright blue light, as if a powerful explosion had occurred. However, this powerful blow did not hit Yuri. In the last second before his death, the boy still found the strength to make one last push. He raised his sword and swung it with all his might at the faceless man's attack, pushing him back away from him. The opponent, of course, missed this blow, but was able to stay on his feet. Yuri straightened up, his second wind having taken hold. I wondered how much time had passed since he had started the battle. It was a bit dangerous. Questions about how he should use the mana control method and how he should swing the sword. All this slowed him down, and therefore he was behind his opponent most of the time. But thanks to his relentless fighting, his mana finally began to gradually stabilize. Taking a breath, Yuri suddenly noticed that the sword in the faceless man's hands was already covered in cracks from his blows. He wanted to use this to his advantage, but suddenly the blade broke into small pieces on its own. And right after him, the faceless man himself disappeared into thin air, which meant the clear victory of the young master. At the end, the enemy waved goodbye in a friendly manner and seemed to thank him for a worthy fight. It looks like it's time for Yuri to return to the cave. The boy closed his eyes, feeling his body already being transported back, and whispered words of gratitude to his ancestor for the useful lesson. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself indeed in the same cave. For some reason, his head hurt a lot. In front of him stood his escorts, who by this time had also managed to complete their tasks. The Death Knight was still sitting in front of the crystals, and, seeing that the boys had woken up, he grinned and suggested that they had had some very interesting dreams. He said that what happened to them was Eric's order, something he left for Brial's heir, who would one day come. In Yuri's past life, the Sword Mountain was destroyed by the Empire, so much so that no one from Briol could reach it. Yuri raised his head and asked the knight, did his ancestor also use mana control? The dead man said no. Eric learned it during his journey to the Eastern Lands in the final years of his life. It is his final legacy, created from the culmination of all his knowledge. Now Yuri is his first successor. This dungeon opens only at the right time. When this dungeon opens, it means it's time to use this power. Yuri asked him what time he was talking about, but the Death Knight couldn't answer. He said that Yuri should figure this out on his own. But the knight was at least able to tell him that this method of mana control was what Eric called a blow to the heart and soul. After this, the dead man asked the boy to kneel down. He was to give him his ancestor's legacy. The boy obediently dropped to one knee in front of the guard and bowed his head. The dead man placed his heavy palm on the crown of the prince's head and began to recite the speech that Eric had asked him to convey to his descendants. First, Yuri must not fear his enemies. The boy nodded in agreement. Second, let the boy do what he believes in. Yuri nodded again. And until the very end, he must fulfill his duty as Brial. Suddenly, the Death Knight grabbed the boy by the hair and lifted his face towards himself. There remains one last commandment that he must pass on from his ancestor before he finally dissolves into thin air. Brials don't disdain honor, even in death. His father and other older relatives always told him this. This is the sacred oath of Briol, and they must all adhere to it. This is how their short journey ended, after which they returned home. As soon as the sun rose, Ina came into Yuri's room to wake him up, as always. The boy winced in irritation at the bright light and shielded his eyes with his hand. He hadn't slept at all. Worried Ina also understood this, since the young gentleman came home very late yesterday. The boy told her that he had simply gone to the royal library and had stayed there for too long, not noticing how time had passed. Yuri actually went there after they returned with Hernando and Gerald to the palace. According to royal genealogy records found in the library, Eric Briol had a brother, A man who disappeared from the annals of history and left no name behind because he renounced his honor. Yuri logically came to the conclusion that it was he who eventually became the Death Knight they saw yesterday in the cave. And he is the true owner of the sword, which now belongs to Yuri. By this time, Ina had brought the youngest his clothes and told him to get ready quickly. The king was looking for him. She doesn't know the exact reason, but after meeting Sir Hernando, the man asked his son to come to him. Yuri sighed heavily. He wasn't surprised to hear this after what had happened yesterday. At the end of the journey, Hernando told the prince that he would report to His Majesty everything that had happened to them in the dungeon. Yuri asked him not to do this so as not to cause unnecessary problems. But the magician said that some rather important events had happened, so they were obliged to tell the king about everything. So Yuri guessed that the magician most likely reported all the details of the campaign to his father. Having dressed, Yuri grabbed his new sword and went down to his father in the throne room. The father immediately got down to business and said that he learned from Hernando that his son not only left the palace of his own free will, but also found the ancestors' dungeon on the Mountain of the Sword. Yuri had no intention of lying to his father, so he only confirmed what the royal mage had said. Then the man noticed his son's new sword and asked if he had found it in the dungeon. The younger son confirmed it. The man came closer. He had recently heard a lot about how the boy had changed a lot. His maid, Bernard, Sand, and even Hernando spoke about it. He placed his hand on his son's head and asked him to tell him what had changed him so much. The boy gripped the hilt of his sword nervously, unsure how to respond. Even if he told the truth, his father wouldn't believe him anyway. They humbled him with a stern look and asked him again, was he really not going to answer? Yuri said that he does not speak out of reluctance. There is another reason. He can't tell what changed him so much because his father clenches his fist, and he's afraid of his reaction. Then the man relaxed his hand and seemed to relax even more and exhaled. And again he asked his son to answer the question, since now there was nothing in the way. Yuri thought for a moment, deciding how best to answer, and finally said that he had a dream. And in this dream the boy committed a terrible sin, which is painful even to remember. The king looked at him in surprise and asked what kind of sin it was. Yuri hesitated and bashfully lowered his eyes, collecting his thoughts. And then he suddenly gathered his courage and admitted that the sin was that he could not save Briol. In his dream, the kingdom became part of a great war in which many innocent people died. He desperately tried to save Briol, but he failed. He lacked the strength, courage, and resourcefulness. As a result, the kingdom fell, and he was forced to flee from it dishonorably. Ultimately, he wandered the world for many years, plagued by guilt, and then died by an enemy's sword. He woke up from this dream and realized that the necklace his mother gave him was missing. Then he suddenly thought, maybe this dream was a warning from his mother, and he decided that it was time to change, that he had enough of bringing nothing but problems to the kingdom, and that he must nobly fulfill his duty as a prince. The father listened to him attentively and then asked what had destroyed the kingdom in the boy's dream. At this point, Yuri hesitated. It was too early to tell his parent about the Empire. Besides, there is a chance that the Empire will not attack, since he is already changing the past. So the boy told his father he wasn't entirely sure what had caused it. There was some dark army there he didn't know. Then the father softened and calmly told his son that it could have been either an ordinary nightmare or a real warning. But he was glad that the younger one had pulled himself together. Yuri didn't like the last phrase about pulling himself together, because that wasn't quite true. If he hadn't returned to the past, he wouldn't have come to his senses. Having received such a chance, he only tries to atone for all his sins and save the kingdom, which he was unable to do in his past life. Suddenly the king had another question. Something needed to be clarified. He ordered his son to bring his newly acquired sword for this purpose. Fior Briol is a genius who has wielded a sword since birth, a man of many titles. He made his name on this continent with his incredible skills. He is considered one of the continent's top 10 strongest athletes. He is also considered the strongest among those same 10. Simply put, he is the strongest swordmaster on the continent whom no one dares to look down on. Fior brought his son to his personal training hall, which Yuri found himself in for the first time. There the king confessed to him that he did not think that any of his sons had the talent to wield a sword. Yuri immodestly said that he was apparently the exception among the three of them. The father didn't like his son's pride in his skills. He extended his sword, pointing it at the younger boy. And he asked him what talent means for a swordsman? Maybe strength, speed, reflexes, or outstanding intelligence? If you have all of this, can you become an outstanding knight? Yuri didn't know what to say. He thought these qualities were sufficient to master swordsmanship. But my father disagreed and confidently said that it wouldn't be enough. What is more important than these things on the surface is what can make you surpass your human capabilities, something that stands even above the crisis or the sense of duty. Suddenly, his father activated his magical core, and Yuri noticed that the aura around his father changed and turned red. The boy felt a strong excitement wash over him as he felt this uncontrollable power, and he gripped the sword tighter in his hands. But just as quickly as it appeared, the aura disappeared. Fiore sheathed his sword and said he himself didn't know the name of this secret feeling. It feels like a kind of call of the sword, if you try to associate it with something. Yuri finally relaxed, though his heart didn't feel particularly calmer. He asked, "Maybe this is what fate is?" The man thought for a moment and nodded. Perhaps so. Yuri looked closely at his blade. In his past life, he had not followed the path of the sword. But what now? Could it be that he's unknowingly embarked on the right path? Or is that something he's yet to discover? Fiore asked his son what he was thinking. Should he hold the sword? Does Yuri hear the sword calling to him? When death approaches, does he still cling to his sword? Yuri tried to focus on his feelings, but he had to honestly admit that he didn't feel anything. However, when he looked up at the king afterward, he no longer resembled his father. Instead of stern brown eyes, two red dots stared at him. Fiore suddenly changed and became like a faceless shadow, and the walls of the training hall seemed to blur in his field of vision and darken. The boy's heart was pounding like crazy. It was as if huge red eyes were staring at him from all sides, ready to swallow his poor soul whole if he made a mistake. Panic began to build in his chest. Suddenly, frightened voices were heard from all around. Blurred silhouettes began begging Yuri to run, to save himself. And then, in the blink of an eye, all of this disappeared from view, and Yuri suddenly found himself in the middle of a huge fire. His house was burning, his kingdom in danger. Yuri found himself back in his adult body, in the midst of a hot, bloody battle. He looked around in horror. Why was Briol on fire again? What was happening to him? Suddenly, strange voices were heard behind him. They were shouting joyfully but with hostility that they had finally found the third prince. A large detachment of imperial warriors ran towards him with swords, and beside them rode the Empire's enormous cavalry. The boy's heart sank in his chest at the sight. He looked at his hands in shock, his head spinning from the amount of emotions and the murderous heat around him. What happened? Why did he suddenly return to this nightmarish past? How did it happen that he again witnessed Briol's fall? One of the enemies took advantage of the prince's confused state and vilely attacked him from behind. Young Briol barely had time to notice this, and at the last moment turned around, stopping his sword with his own. With a little more force, he managed to push him away from himself and cut open his enemy's chest. Then he heard that more people appeared next to him, but this time it was not an enemy detachment, but his subordinates. They shielded the prince and told him to run away to save himself while they held off the imperial army. Yuri watched in horror as everything unfolded. Could it be that all this time he'd spent in his younger self's body had just been a strange, long dream? In the end, Briol was destined to collapse? There was nothing he could do to stop it. Yuri didn't flee the battlefield this time. He stood amid the blazing flames, glaring at his opponents. He's not the same now. Even if he can't save his kingdom, he made an oath that he will never fear his enemies. He will fight for what he believes in. He promised to fulfill Briol's duty to the very end, even if it meant facing his own death. Therefore, the young man bravely entered the battle, refusing the opportunity of a shameful escape. He boldly cut down with his sword first one enemy, then a second, then all the rest who dared to approach him. One of the spearmen tried to pierce his stomach, but the guy blocked the blow with his hand and pushed his weapon aside. And he himself pulled his sword forward and killed the enemy first. There were still many enemies before him, as expected. The Empire greatly outnumbered them. Yuri suspected that against so many people he was a dead man, but he would not disdain honor from now on, even in death. He will fight until the very end, until his arms and legs give out, or until one of his enemies proves stronger, giving him a noble end. Suddenly, the fiery battlefield around him cleared, and Yuri could breathe freely again. He felt as if he'd been yanked out of a deep sleep. His eyes widened in confusion, and he suddenly heard his father's agitated voice. He's 13 again, still in the training room with his father, who's just been frantically shaking him by the shoulders, begging him to wake up. The boy looked around fearfully, still muttering something under his breath about a black army. Where had the enemies gone? His father drew his attention back to him and asked the boy to calm down. He said Yuri had just had a hallucination. He excitedly asked his son what he saw in his vision. The boy was too excited to answer, but his father managed to draw his own conclusions. He looked at him softly. placed his hand on his shoulder, and suddenly admitted he'd been wrong about his son. He'd proven he could handle a sword with dignity. Yuri smiled proudly. He agreed and said he had made his decision. He was ready to strive for it. But the gentle smile on his father's face didn't last long. A second later, he frowned again, much to his son's dismay. Yuri suddenly patted his father on the back softly, in a friendly way, and said that he didn't have to worry so much. He's a damn genius after all, so he can handle anything. But he shouldn't have said that, because right then and there he got a scolding from his father for bragging. And he went off to training with a big bang for it. Bernard had become so accustomed to Yuri constantly getting hit on the head for his antics that he didn't even bother asking why he had a bruise this time. He noticed that today the king was applying himself to his son more intensely than usual, but that didn't mean he would allow Yuri to work less hard in class because of that. The boy rubbed his neck sullenly and said that, so, he understood it. Suddenly, Yuri began to think that Bernard had only stayed on as a coach in Briola because of his father. He asked the coach about this. Did Bernard start teaching at the palace because he lost a duel to his father? And were these the conditions? Bernard said that was true. Then Yuri asked if the coach would have stayed at the palace if there was nothing holding him there. But would Yuri have asked for it? Bernard said confidently that if he had, he wouldn't have set foot here. The coach smiled and noted that the student had apparently become quite attached to him. Then Bernard casually said that he would stay in the palace if Yuri showed him something in return that might interest him. For example, the swordsmanship of his ancestor, Eric Briol. Yuri stepped back in confusion and asked again if he really only wanted the mastery of the progenitor sword. Bernard said thoughtfully that he found it very interesting, so he really wanted to try it. Yuri replied that it would be very difficult to arrange. Although such requests were perfectly logical, given his rank as sword demon, Bernard said that it was okay if Yuri hadn't yet fully mastered this skill. He had foreseen that. Yuri agreed that this would not be a problem, but this skill would not help Bernard in any way. This sword skill is related to the method of mana control. This was the first time Bernard had heard of these two components being used as a single unit. Mana control is typically used to enhance a sword's mastery. That's why the boy said it would be difficult. Besides, the method itself is only half studied. Nevertheless, Bernard agreed to these conditions, which made the boy very happy. Bernard agrees to begin teaching even an incompletely studied method, and in exchange he will still remain teaching in Briol, even after the terms of the bet are over. Even if the young prince hasn't fully explored it, there will be parts that Bernard will be able to understand thanks to his experience. Yuri was satisfied with this. So, at this point, their agreement was successfully sealed. Then Bernard took up the sword and suggested that Yuri demonstrate this skill to his elder right then and there. Yuri also grabbed the sword and said that this method is called A Blow to the Heart and Soul by Yuri Briol. But before the battle began, the coach said that he wanted to confess something else to the young man. He had, after all, originally planned to stay in Briol, so he had essentially just deceived the boy. His Majesty allowed Bernard to stay here and teach swordsmanship for at least another 10 years. Yuri was, of course, offended by this, but he didn't have time to think it over properly, because at that very moment Bernard announced the beginning of their battle. The boy's irritation played into his hands, so he pounced on Bernard with doubly motivated retaliation. In the evening, Yuri lay in his bed at sunset and thoughtfully looked at the ceiling. His life has changed so much lately. In this future, Briol will not be destroyed because of his mistake. Even though no special measures were taken for this, the fact that Bernard decided to stay in Briol and not leave, as in his past life, proves it. Changing the future seems so vague and uncertain to Yuri, but little by little, it is definitely changing. But that's not all. This time, he must stop the Empire, without making a single mistake. Suddenly, Ina entered his room. Having overheard Yuri's monologue, she said that he just had to stop causing trouble. Yuri sat up in bed, agitated. What had he done? Was there something else on the schedule he'd missed? But Ina didn't mean today. Yuri had a meeting scheduled for tomorrow, and Ina had come to remind him. Tomorrow there will be a meeting of elders, and for some reason the king said that young Briol is obliged to attend it. He needs to leave early tomorrow morning. It was said that most of the elders would be present at this meeting. Ina grabbed the young gentleman's hand hopefully, and she said that tomorrow at the meeting there would definitely be stubborn and scary people, but the prince should under no circumstances start a fight. Yuri was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief and assured Ina that he would definitely not do anything stupid. The next day, Yuri arrived at the conference room just in time. Everyone was assembled. Ina was right about the audience not being the most pleasant. The elders' objections began right from the start of the meeting. Duke Eugene Gennard spoke first, angrily declaring that the prince should not study an unproven method of mana control. Judging by the reactions of the other council members, they shared this man's opinion. Usually the council discusses issues of governing the kingdom, but this time the main star was the third prince. This place had long since become a playground for the struggle for the throne. Now Yuri understood why his father hadn't attended such gatherings in the past. Eugene told Yuri that it would be better for him to spend his time learning the Briol method rather than learning some obscure method. Another duke, however, entered into an argument with him. How dare he claim his ancestors' legacy as some unproven method? Then Eugene suddenly asked a provocative question. Why were they so sure this was truly the ancestors' legacy? They scolded him for doubting the prince's words. The duke immediately corrected himself and said that he was not against Yuri, he just needed to see for himself. Yuri chuckled. He was even flattered that a meeting of elders had been held to discuss his method of mana control. Yuri secretly shamed him. Duke Gennard was the first to bow his head to the empire once Briol fell. Realizing that he could not win this discussion on his own, Eugene asked Sir Sen's opinion. Sir Sen has already crossed paths with the third prince. He is the very captain of the Knights of Briol. The man calmly replied that he was not in a state to make hasty judgments right now. Each method of mana control has its own pros and cons, and each person has their own unique traits. Eugene was furious. The captain of the Briol Knights himself said he wasn't sure about this mana control method. Wasn't that a good reason to forbid the boy from using it? So he thinks it's better to forget about this method for now. The Duke, who had initially expressed his disagreement, spoke again. Sir Sen did not mean this at all. He was saying that each method has its own value. But the other dukes stood up for Eugene. They believed Duke Gennard was concerned that this method of mana control could harm the prince. Yuri looked at the faces of the remaining dukes and guessed that things were bad. He turned out to be right. Most agreed with Eugene, but the real reasons weren't rooted in concern for the prince. The situation has changed dramatically. With a little time spent studying mana control, it's possible to completely change the core's operation. But due to the experience of the progenitor's illusion, the blow to the heart and soul was already firmly rooted in his core. Unfortunately, he can't even explain it to them, so what should Yuri do? Help came completely unexpectedly. Suddenly, another council member stood up for the boy. He sarcastically remarked that Eugene, as always, was choosing his words cunningly to prove his point. But he would like to ask one question. Has anyone here ever fought an orc? The man rose from the table and bowed to his comrades. He introduced himself as the Free Lord, Calcio Iran. Duke Gennard was indignant. How dare a simple baron attend the Council of Elders? The man ignored the reproach and instead said that he himself did not want to come, but there was nothing else to do. After all, Duke Sindor trusted him and asked him to be present at the meeting. Sindor, as befits his title, is a lord who guards the borders as well as the entire front line. He is known as a true soldier who spent his life on the battlefield and also for not being interested in the affairs of the nobility. Those around him were surprised that Duke Sindor sent an envoy to the meeting of elders, although he had previously had no interest in such events. Calcio said that his master, seeing how the nobles were playing their political games at this table, realized that he had to intervene. In a real fight, the type of mana control method matters little. Whether it's Briol's method or the imperial art of the Lionheart, it all depends on the knight himself. Calcio asked if His Highness agreed with this point of view. Yuri agreed. He didn't really understand why this issue was being decided here. He would still do what he saw fit. So, it means that the prince who wields the sword decided to follow the will of the progenitor and the method of mana control. Calcio asked why then people who do not own the business, who have no authority whatsoever, continue to interfere in the prince's affairs. Well, usually the noise comes from people sitting at a desk who have never held a sword in their lives, so it's not surprising. Eugene did not like his tone and told the Free Lord that he was speaking very rashly. Aaron apologized for his rudeness, but did not take back his words. He mentioned it before, but will anyone finally answer him? Who of those present has ever fought an orc? Do the dukes really think the orcs will care what mana control method someone uses against them? The dukes had to agree with this, but they still insisted that the prince was still very young and could not make such serious decisions. Yuri asked irritably, should he really change his method of mana control just because they thought it was wrong? Perhaps it is no longer just difficult for him to correct his technique, but practically impossible. Calcio concluded that, in any case, His Highness was unlikely to change anything. They wouldn't extract the core from him by force, after all. They certainly couldn't do that even if they wanted to. So what's all this arguing about? Moreover, the king, as far as Calcio knows, also agrees that his son should study the method of his ancestor. He accused the dukes of simply sitting there and ruining the poor prince's psyche. Eugene was already at the limit of his anger. It infuriated him that the Margrave's messenger was saying such things. Although he himself had been keeping a low profile lately, Calcio glared at them. Did hundreds of people really have to die before they realized these were troubled times? They probably didn't see or hear the reports of daily soldier deaths. On the day Calcio left the Margraviate, 4 men died. Moreover, he personally buried his friend, with whom he had close contact, and with whom he had breakfast every day. Orcs never rest. They spend their entire lives fighting and killing. This monologue made both the dukes and Yuri himself think about the unstable situation the kingdom really was in. Come to think of it, around this time a problem arose between Briol and the Principality of Klein, according to Yuri's recollections. During this period of time, orcs began to repeatedly cross the border and cause enormous damage. Calcio said that the orcs' behavior had changed recently. They had become much more sinister than they had been before. Then Yuri asked, "How are things with Klein? Wasn't the Klein Principality army taking part in this?" The man replied that their border guards had suddenly retreated, and the border village was completely enslaved. Some people died, and others became orc slaves. The situation was stalemate. Yuri was convinced that everything was unfolding exactly as it had in the past. Was this a civil war, or was the Duke's third child involved? Yuri asked the last question out loud, but no one answered. Then the boy decided that he had had enough for today and announced that he was going to leave. Eugene wanted to detain him, because they had not yet finished discussing the topic they had started. But Yuri smiled and told the Dukes to discuss more important matters than his choice of mana control method. For example, protection from the Klein Principality and the orcs. The Duke watched him with an angry glare, but had no right to say anything against it. That evening, having stopped for the night at a local tavern, Calcio reported to his master everything that had happened that day. They communicated via a magic orb. Even the prince's last phrase about the elders finally leaving the child who is going through puberty alone. The man said that rumors were spreading that the third prince had changed very much. He himself also noticed this at the last meeting. He told the Duke that the boy had not been so bad when he stood his ground. Sir Sindor gave orders to watch him for a while. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him, but the Count said that we needed to take a closer look at him and, if necessary, study his biography. Calcio accepted the order, and the Count bid him farewell. He would contact him again soon to find out more. After this, the glowing ball dimmed and turned off. The call ended. Calcio looked out the window thoughtfully. How peacefully people lived. Even considering the number of soldiers dying at the border every day. Suddenly, in the crowd, the man noticed the outline of a familiar short figure. It was the third prince, Yuri Briol. Pulling the hood of his robe up, he carefully made his way down the street, accompanied by the royal mage. Hernando was inspired by the way they had sneaked out of the palace so discreetly at night. As a child, he had been quite a troubled child and often ran away. Only now, Hernando was constantly worried that someone was following them and might recognize them. Yuri didn't understand why he was so worried. Even though Hernando can leave the castle whenever he wants, when he goes for walks with Yuri, he always feels like they're about to commit a riot. The boy said that if he'd been planning to do something indecent, he wouldn't have taken the magician with him. Hernando asked, "Where are they going then?" The boy turned and smiled conspiratorially at him. They were heading to the capital's most illegal casino. Hernando asked, confused, why this was so, but Yuri said that they weren't going to do anything bad. But the prince had no intention of doing so. He asked Hernando to take him to the casino, because he was sure the magician knew where it was. He suddenly became more serious and swore to the magician that this time he was going to such a place not for his own pleasure, but for Briol. Hernando was speechless. First the mountain of swords, now this. How much had Yuri prepared? Inspired by their plan, Hernando happily agreed to go to the casino, which he visited more often than at home. In Yuri's past life, there were several people in Briol that many people talked about. The first was the boss, who was a major loan shark and ran the entire criminal world. Next up is the best merchant on the continent, a giant of trade. And one more. The one who beheaded the boss of the criminal underworld and kept all of Briol in fear. She wasn't just a regular killer. She was calculating, agile, and intelligent. And she took her place as the ruler of the criminal underworld. Yuri knows about one of the 3 people who died at her hands. In this life, he was still alive, a major moneylender today. His name is Goryo. It was he who Yuri met at the casino. The man was delighted that such a distinguished man had decided to do business with him. The prince noted with a grin that he had been told everything about them even before he and Hernando entered the hall. Goryo remarked that it would be strange not to recognize the king's magician and his youngest son, Prince Briol. Yuri agreed and then said that he didn't come to the casino to play games and have fun. Goryo quickly got the hint. He gestured toward the spacious dining room of his establishment and suggested they step inside and discuss everything at the table. As they walked inside, Hernando whispered to Yuri that he hadn't warned him that they weren't going to play anything today. Yuri asked the magician to be quiet. After that, Goryo assumed the young prince had come to borrow money from him since he wasn't planning on playing that day. The boy confirmed this. He wanted to borrow money and invest it. Goryo suggested that the prince wanted to set up a personal charitable foundation. But since he borrows money from him and not from the bank, it means the prince has quite big ambitions. Yuri stopped him and asked him to stop interrogating him. It was none of his business how he spent the money. Goryo immediately sat down and apologized for his behavior. He should have been more careful if he didn't want the deal to fall through. Yuri said everything was fine. Then Goryo cautiously asked why he needed the money. The boy said he planned to use the money to buy magranja, a spice from the Klein region, as demand for it would soon increase. Hernando and Goryo were very interested in this statement, although they thought that the young gentleman was delirious. Magranja is used to make high-quality spices, but it is hardly worth it. Yuri did not back down and convincingly said that soon everything would be exactly as he said. Hernando had heard that war had broken out in the Klein Principality and that orcs were roaming everywhere. But he didn't think the price of spices would rise so much because of it. Perhaps the prince simply wants to buy out the Klein Principality's specialty in advance? This look in the boy's eyes. The devil knows what lies behind it, and what he's really thinking about. Goryo thought that Yuri was different from the rumors circulating about him. Moreover, it seemed he wasn't acting solely on the information he'd just uncovered. So the man decided to agree to the deal after all. Yuri asked him as an investor, not as a prince, how much money he could lend him. The man took a little time to think about the whole situation and, in the end, his conditions turned out to be satisfactory for Yuri. They entered into a written agreement in which they set out all the terms of the deal. Hernando was quite surprised that the count had given the boy money at all, and a lot of it at that. But, in his opinion, this was too much. He should have at least told Hernando about this beforehand. Maybe he was planning to come and play. Yuri, laughing, replied that if he had told the magician about everything in advance, he would have immediately taken him to his father. And now they went to the trading floor, since Yuri needed to do something there. In fact, magranja is guaranteed to be profitable. The only alchemist who knows the recipe, Duke Klein's attending physician, will die in the coming war. This is a product that will not have a fixed price, at least until a replacement is found. Surprisingly, instead of the central trading area, Yuri brought his friend to some quiet, almost deserted place, and he stopped in front of a low, very old and dilapidated house, which didn't even have normal windows. Suddenly, he told Hernando that they were there and the boy couldn't believe his eyes. What was the prince doing in such a squalid, crumbling place? But the boy didn't listen. He knocked hard on the front door several times and kept calling for Ileana Wood to come over. Soon a young woman appeared from behind the door. She was well and neatly dressed, her expression confused and even a little frightened. Yuri hastened to greet her and introduced himself as the third Prince of Briol, so that she would not worry about the uninvited guests. The boy extended his hand to her and said that he wanted her to do something for him. As they were leaving, Hernando continued to pester Yuri with questions, because what Yuri had done did not fit into their plans at all. The boy entrusted the purchase of the magranji to some failing company. Who would take such a risk in such a situation? But only Yuri knew that everything would soon change. Ileana is now a trader for a declining company, but very soon she will become rich, thanks to her abilities, and become the greatest merchant in the kingdom. And unlike Goryo, who is full of honor and praise but resorts to all sorts of dirty tricks, Ilian keeps his promises to his clients. Since the girl was a legendary merchant even in Yuri's past life, in this life he can befriend her and make her a mythical merchant. Giving up trying to understand the boy's decisions, Hernando asked him if they could now finish their business for the day and go home. But Yuri stated that this was not all, and that he still had one more matter to deal with. Hernando tried to stop him, but Yuri was adamant and confidently headed into some dark alley. Hernando became alarmed and asked him where they were going. But Yuri's thoughts were elsewhere. Major underworld figures are ready to help him. Only one thing remains for the plan to succeed. Yuri took Hernando to some seedy alley where there was a large concentration of homeless people. Things were so bad that they were fighting among themselves for a piece of bread. And in all this madness, Yuri needed one specific person. He was sure that at this time she must have lived in this place. And he was not mistaken when he finally noticed the dark-haired girl he needed nearby. She, along with other peers of Yuri, sat by a half-broken wooden basin and washed torn clothes. The boy turned to her and solemnly introduced himself, stating both his name and his title. The girl calmly asked him again, "Is it really a prince?" No one would have thought it. But this girl would become a ruthless killer in the future, who would kill Goryo and take his place. In a past life, she survived the Assassination Academy and later became its leader. Her name is Asuna. She looked nothing like the cold-blooded assassin now. Her clear blue eyes stared at the prince in confusion. Yuri, noticing the girl's anxiety, said that she could calm down. He simply decided to stop here during his patrol to make a small donation to those in need. Yuri extended his hand to Hernando and asked him to convey what he was saying. Hernando reluctantly handed him a heavy bag filled to the brim with gold coins. At that moment, Yuri's gaze fell on the little girl who was hiding behind Asana's back. In her past life, Asana borrowed an obscene amount of money from Goryo to cure this child. Like everyone else who borrowed money from him, Asana fell into debt. It was then that the legendary killer was born. She simply had no choice and had to fight for survival somehow. But Yuri has the power to change that. Yuri gave the girl the entire bag and advised her to spend it on healing her younger sister in the temple. The girl asked in surprise what the prince wanted in return, and he did indeed have something to ask for in return. But now, he didn't need anything from her. Yuri reminded her of his name and asked her to remember it, because they would definitely meet again in the future. After this, he pulled the hood back over his head and walked away with Hernando. On the way, the magician asked him why Yuri had decided to give the money to that homeless girl. Yuri vaguely replied that it was an investment. Now everyone he needed was connected to his destiny, and in the future, he would be able to use these connections to his advantage. But Yuri needed one more person, whom he and Hernando had not visited today. Yuri suddenly stopped and turned to his comrade. He had one question for him. The boy asked the magician what he saw then in the ancestor's dungeon. Hernando smiled and easily replied that his illusion involved gambling. He played the game of life in the Empire in the Basragas casino. Yuri expected to hear something different from him. But overall, this suits the magician just fine. Then, he decided to change the subject and tell the magician something else about today. Yuri gave him a friendly slap on the shoulder and asked him to be careful. The next day, the king summoned Hernando to the throne room for a conversation. He heard that the guy was on patrol with Yuri last night. The king asked him to tell him what had happened there. And Hernando, like an obedient subordinate, did. That at first the prince slandered him to leave the palace with him, and they went to the casino. The biggest one they had in the capital. The king wasn't even surprised by this. He asked if they were gambling there. But then Hernando decided to lie to cover for Yuri at his personal request. The boy replied with a smile that yes, they were playing. The magician thought the prince was quite skilled at card games, but it turned out he wasn't. The boy lost all the money he'd given him. The king asked what they had been doing after leaving the casino. They had been gone for quite some time. Hernando could have said that the third prince surprised him by first borrowing a large sum of money from Goryo and then giving it to an unknown merchant. And after that, he even gave a lot of money to an orphan he'd never seen before. But he didn't want to let the prince down. Instead, he said the boy simply walked around the city and observed how ordinary citizens lived. He was interested in their way of life. And then they returned to the palace together, as the king knew. Hernando confirmed this and said that they did nothing else yesterday. The king propped his head up with his hand and sighed heavily. So that's how it was. After thinking for a moment, he changed the subject. And he asked Hernando if he would be present at the upcoming ball. The guy straightened up and replied with a smile that he definitely would. The king thought Hernando was saying he wasn't interested in such things. But human desires are fickle. Hernando is still interested in attending this event, and he hasn't danced in a long time. Meanwhile, Yuri had another grueling training session with Bernard. While the boy was catching his breath after one of the fights, he noticed something interesting. The maids working nearby often spied on them. Yuri brought this to the elder's attention and said he had some female fans. Bernard has become quite popular among the maids lately for some reason. Yuri laughingly suggested to the coach that they go to the upcoming ball. There would likely be people there who would like to see him in a nice suit. Bernard said he wasn't interested. He was also interested in the aspect of the progenitor's method. As Yuri had said, this sword had no specific shape. Yuri actually recently made a similar statement. The sword's movement in this case is more like a stream. The method of mana control, which is also a form of swordsmanship, proved too complex for Bernard to master on his own. He needs to see Yuri in real combat to learn more about him. Incidentally, he's noticed that Yuri's skills have improved greatly recently. After these words, Yuri felt guilty for trying to erase the traces of the Briol method he learned in his past life, because in the end, it only increased his strength. Suddenly, Bernard told the boy that he should slow down a little in his studies because he was worried. It feels like Yuri is always in a hurry and demands too much of himself. Despite the fact that Yuri has already achieved a lot for his age, his body is not yet strong. Yuri smiled brightly and promised that he would sort it out, so the coach had nothing to worry about. He had already managed to rest from the previous round and suggested to the elder that they continue training. Yuri threw aside his wooden training sword, and he suggested the next round be played using their real swords. He needed to get stronger, so he needed to set his goals accordingly. Bernard didn't mind, so he also drew his sword and prepared for battle. Then Yuri offered him a bet. Bernard would go to the ball if the boy could hit him at least once. But Bernard refused. He said that he was not going to agree to these conditions because he would win anyway, and the prince never kept his promises. The boy became a little angry, and at that moment activated his inner core. He jumped up from his seat as if scalded and attacked the elder, to prove the coach wrong in his judgments about him. However, that day, Yuri couldn't hit him even once. A few days later, the day of the ball arrived. Guests began arriving at the palace in expensive carriages. In one of these sat a young, influential blonde man, and next to him was his younger sister, also fair-haired. The boy noticed that the girl truly couldn't take her eyes off the local beauty. It was the second prince of the empire, Georg Ivan Granzian. And the girl who was looking out the window with admiration turned out to be none other than the same Katerina whom Yuri knew in his past life. She hadn't been in these parts for a very long time, and besides, she really wanted to meet someone as soon as possible. Meanwhile, in the castle, the final preparations for the ball and banquet were being completed. Ina helped Yuri get ready for the event and even rehearsed a waltz with him in case the boy suddenly had to dance with someone. Musicians were already playing in the hall, and it gradually began to fill with people. Various noble people divided into pairs for dancing, while others simply chatted pleasantly and bowed to comrades they had not seen for a long time. In the center of the hall, the king sat on a throne, his gaze attentively watching everything that was happening at the ball. The Briol princes gathered around the table with food and were chatting cheerfully about something, until Yuri noticed an interesting figure in the banquet hall and was distracted by him. Duke Sindor also came to the banquet. As expected, he was very different from the average knight. But Yuri didn't dwell on this for long. He turned back to his older brother and asked him if he had been having problems with his eyes lately. He had started wearing glasses more often. The guy said that his eyesight wasn't that bad. But then his words were interrupted by a loud roar of a horn. It was the servants who announced the arrival of the prince and princess who had arrived from the empire. The king personally approached and greeted George. They shook hands respectfully. Georg thanked the man for his hospitality and then asked him for permission to introduce his younger sister to everyone. Then Katerina entered the hall and charmingly bowed to everyone present. Yuri's heart began to beat faster when he saw her, as memories of their difficult romance in a past life immediately came flooding back, and about its sad ending, betrayal, the burned Briol, and a short note. Sorry, in this life, he can't get engaged to Katerina. He never made the same mistake as in his past life. Therefore, when the girl entered the hall, he lowered his head and did not even look into her eyes, although she turned her gaze on him. Fortunately, her attention soon shifted to another Briol brother, and Yuri did not have to cross paths with her. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Yuri continued to stand in the corner and glance sideways at the others. As expected of his older brother Cedric, he treated everyone present with respect and was currently waltzing with a cute girl. Others gazed at him dreamily. Cedric's nobility and influence clearly indicated the makings of a good future king. Suddenly, Yuri felt that someone was looking at him intently, and when he turned around, his eyes met Katerina's. Yuri was very lucky that she did not come up to talk to him, since Katerina was distracted by the second Prince Briol. Yuri scolded himself for his display of weakness. He still had feelings for Katerina, even though he knew it would ultimately end badly. Then Ina suddenly approached him and distracted him from his bad thoughts. She smiled kindly and offered His Highness his favorite cookie. Yuri thanked her and praised her for her work, but Ina jokingly said that she didn't work as hard as the maids who cleaned up after the prince every day. Yuri snorted and took the plate of cookies from her, but he smiled and wished her luck with her work that evening. When she left, Yuri leaned his elbows on the table and raised his head to the ceiling. The boy sighed heavily. The ball had only just begun, and he was already tired. Then, unexpectedly, the second prince of the empire approached him, Georg Ivan Grancian. He had been a commander on many battlefields in the past. He was one of those who brought Briol to its decline. Yuri bowed to him and introduced himself. He had to control himself to keep the hostility lurking in his soul from showing. He shouldn't show hostility. Nothing has happened in this life yet, so he needs to keep a straight face. But the imperial prince's face showed no sign of friendliness. His green eyes suddenly seemed to glow, and the light around him slowly began to dim. Yuri suddenly felt again the same anxious feeling that had washed over him when he was in the training room with his father. It was as if long, glowing tentacles were reaching out to him from all sides, trying to grab him by the neck, tear his clothes, and hit him. The prince of the empire came closer and asked if he remembered correctly that the prince of Briol would be 13 years old this year, but did not wait for an answer. He also suddenly turned away from the boy and said that Yuri was a magnificent talent, as expected of Fiore's son. It was quite threatening for a simple greeting. Yuri thought the prince was young, but even at his age he was already very strong. Georg struck him as a rather frightening idiot. Both brother and sister were birds of a feather. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. Georg suddenly collided with Ina, and she, unable to hold the tray in her hands, spilled wine right on the young prince's cloak. The maid looked at her hands in confusion and hastened to ask the master for forgiveness. But from the blonde's face, it was clear that he was not going to quietly sort out this situation. In his view, this child, that is, Ina, made a mistake, for which he must be punished. George drew his sword from its sheath and held it forward, very close to Ina. According to the laws of the empire, such an act would require the offending servant to be beheaded. Yuri was furious. This bastard deliberately started a fight with Ina so he could have a place to vent his negativity. Fortunately, the king intervened in this squabble and told the prince that if he wanted blood, he should shed it on his own land and not spoil the royal banquet. George put his sword back into its sheath with displeasure and asked for the public's attention. He said pompously that the Empire and Briol had always respected each other. Could it be that the king no longer had such intentions since he was entering into disputes? The guy frowned and reminded Fiore of what happened in Gatinsh. When the king executed an imperial knight outside Briol's territory, the emperor always respected Fiore and did not hold him accountable for his actions. Georg said that the same thing had just happened. This must be done to preserve the honor and dignity of both peoples. Yuri recalled that in the past his father had indeed once executed one knight of the empire of his own free will. Seeing how he remembered the past, Yuri realized that the honor of the imperial family depended on it. George drew his sword again. Because of the king's aforementioned mistake, he was no longer able to resist George. Stopping the prince now would be tantamount to challenging the empire. But Yuri had a great responsibility. Duties and conditions, ideal and reality, justification and power. However, Briol does not neglect honor, even after death. That's how he promised his ancestor to live. Therefore, he was obliged to intervene. Yuri immediately stepped forward and told His Highness that this was his subordinate. So her mistakes are the prince's too. So he's ready to take responsibility. And while that might not be enough, he's still a prince. So the boy politely asked the boy to forgive the girl for her mistake. He was a sinner in his past life, but this life is his punishment. And he is ready to answer for his words. Ina's death, the third prince offered the eldest to fight him, since it was so important for him to defend his honor. But in response, the second prince of the empire only laughed loudly. And then his face changed just as abruptly, and he looked at the boy with an unfriendly smile. Georg asked if he could address the prince simply as Yuri. The boy allowed him. The boy said that since the third prince had made a good proposal, he would accept it. He asked if the king would object. The man sighed heavily and said that they could do whatever they wanted. In a normal situation, Georg himself would have taken part in this duel, but for the sake of the dignity of the imperial family, he will appoint another contender for Yuri. He would send the youngest knight suitable for Yuri's age, and he would duel him. Yuri thanked him. At this point, the prince ended the conversation and left Yuri alone. The boy himself then approached the still frightened Ina and sat down next to her. He took her hand and told her it was all over and she could breathe a sigh of relief. He suggested she go and rest. The girl burst into tears, grabbed the young prince's hand, and thanked him for his kindness. But she couldn't just shift the blame onto Yuri. He told her there was nothing to worry about. Everything had already been decided. He asked the other maids to take Ina to her room, and soon after that, he himself left the ballroom. He was already quite tired of this evening. Yuri left the hall and walked down the dark corridor to his room. However, Cedric ambushed him there. He stopped him and asked what the younger man had been thinking when he offered the Imperial Prince a duel. Yuri approached him and said that he simply could not stand and watch Ina die. The elder's gaze suddenly softened. He said that Yuri was truly incorrigible and patted him on the head. The boy bowed his head and smiled contentedly. It was a pleasure to hear the praise. He hadn't received that from his older brother in so long. Cedric asked his brother if he could help him. At first, it might seem like choosing an opponent for the boy was a gesture of goodwill, but it wasn't. If the skills of both opponents are on the same level, then even if something happens, Yuri may have problems. Cedric said that they didn't need to talk about it. He would make sure that everything went well. But Yuri asked him not to. Declaring a duel was his choice, so it was up to him to deal with it. Cedric smiled and finally agreed to trust his brother. He poked him on the cheek and said he believed in him. The situation with George did get a little tense at the ball, but Cedric will calm him down and sort everything out. So Yuri can go and rest easy. Yuri thanked him. And he thought to himself that in his past life, if they hadn't been captured by the Empire, his brother would have ruled their kingdom with dignity. What would their nation be like then? This time, he must do everything to see what comes of it. For this, he will fight and win, and it doesn't matter who his opponent is. The promised duel was organized and decided to take place right the next morning. The two opponents took their places in the arena and prepared for the fight, while a little further away the palace guests sat, playing the role of the audience. Hernando sat next to the king and shared that he would never have thought that the young prince would take part in such a duel. Sir Sand noticed that the prince's rival was very calm and confident in his abilities. He is a knight who wields a sword with great skill, as expected of a knight of the Empire. Sin wasn't sure if Yuri could handle such an opponent, but Hernando wasn't worried at all. Yuri himself was in an elevated state of mind, and with sparkling eyes awaited the start of the battle. Great Mage. Of all the ranks awarded to mages by the Mystical Tower, this is the rank no one has ever achieved. A title granted only to those who have mastered an exclusive mystical path. Among all of them, the Exploration of Fate stands out as an exclusive mystical path that allows one to gain a complete understanding of the fate of the world. Only Hernando, who received permission from the world itself, was able to master it. But, at some point, his abilities failed him. That day, he was playing cards for money with Yuri. It was the first time he had lost money in a serious game since mastering the exclusive mystical path. He could have written it all off as a simple coincidence, but he knew that it was not so. Usually he can read his opponent's cards and even their luck with one quick glance, but he saw nothing when he played with Yuri, and that figure he could see through the illusion of the Sword Mountain. Black hair and eyes, the symbol of the royal family of Briol. That haughty look definitely belonged to the third prince. He swung his sword, refusing to give up even as his entire body bled. And in the end, the illusion ended with him collapsing to the ground, filled with despair. That was in this timeline. The situation, which Hernando had considered a simple misunderstanding, became extremely suspicious for him. However, when the prince acted strangely during their last patrol, Hernando used the fate investigation on him and everything was confirmed. From his research, Hernando concluded that Yuri had no destiny for some reason. That's why he wasn't the least bit worried about this boy, because he was building his own destiny with his own hands. Yuri quickly prepared for the fight and told Georg that he was ready to begin the duel. He had already warmed up sufficiently. The Imperial Knight then also agreed that the battle could begin. He was ready. The king, sitting at the head of the arena, announced the beginning of their duel. The boys took a defensive position, waited a few seconds, and then Fior solemnly announced the start. Yuri was the first to jump from his seat and ran at high speed towards his opponent. And with his very first blow, he managed to hit his opponent. Yuri scratched his cheek with the blade of his sword. The Imperial Knight apparently greatly underestimated his opponent, as he did not manage to seriously engage in the battle from the very beginning. At first, he only had to try to keep up with Yuri and reflect his swift blows. But over time, he managed to catch the right pace and catch up with the third Prince of Briol in strength. The king watched the battle closely and asked Hernando what his prediction would be for this duel. The guy honestly admitted that he couldn't be absolutely sure about this. The king sighed and for some reason asked Hernando if it was true that the boy had come to Brioli by chance. Hernando said that was true and then answered the man's next question and said that his time to go had not yet come. The king valued him highly enough, so this news came as a relief. He wished the mage had stayed with them longer, and then he latched onto Hernando's very first answer again. He asked if he could take the sorcerer's prediction to mean that nothing special would happen. Hernando answered a question with a question and asked His Majesty's opinion. Which of the two opponents looked stronger? Fiore looked at his son's opponent, whose aura was terrifying even from a distance, and whose gaze was bold and threatening. The king told Hernando without a shadow of a doubt that his opponent was stronger than his son. Hernando didn't answer him. His first visit to Briol was truly by chance, because the most powerful man on the continent, capable of influencing the fate of the world, was here. However, the sword couldn't be removed, so he decided there was no longer any reason to stay here. Hernando confessed to the king that at one time he had indeed thought about leaving the castle. At that moment, the Knight of the Empire rushed at Yuri, swinging his sword. But there was no worry or fear on the boy's face. A confident smile adorned it. Hernando confessed to the king that Yuri and his incredible abilities were currently one of the main reasons why he still remained in the castle. At that moment, Yuri decided that he had enough of testing the waters in battle with his opponent and could finally show what he was truly capable of. The guy suddenly became many times faster and with all his might struck the blade of his sword straight at the Empire Knight's neck. The enemy held his breath. The annoying thought that he had lost, that he was a corpse, had already flashed through his mind. The astonished audience gaped in shock. Even Prince George and his younger sister. Only Hernando was not surprised like the others, but only smiled contentedly. Surprisingly, even at such tremendous speed, Yuri demonstrated an amazing level of weapon control and stopped his sword just centimeters from the knight's face. The crowd rejoiced. What a performance the young prince had given them. Yuri Briel had won the duel. Hernando jumped joyfully from his chair. Fate had brought him to this kingdom, and here he met someone who defied his destiny. From life to death and back again. Even Prince George applauded Yuri Briel, admiring the young prince's skills. The young master's sword changed the fate of both George, his representative, and the maid. Every step he takes always defies fate. Yuri Briel is unconquerable, someone who lives in defiance of the world's fate. Hernando clapped his hands and shouted from his seat to the boy that it was simply amazing. At that moment, the magician thought that he really wanted to see with his own eyes how Yuri would change the fate of this world. Time is such a tricky thing. It never stands still. Before they could blink, 5 whole years had passed since that duel. The young maid ran down the corridor of Briol Castle, very worried about something. She had made a mistake. The girl tried to escape and correct her mistake before she was caught, but it was too late. Someone blocked her path. She was new, so she didn't know the rules of the palace and the people in it very well. But from the black hair of the guy who blocked her path, she realized that he belonged to the Briol family. The young man looked at her sternly and asked what she was doing here. The girl tried to pull herself together and calm down. She needed to answer as she'd been taught, but first she needed to figure out which Briol was standing in front of her. The other maids taught her that if she saw a man with a dull face, it was definitely His Majesty. If the guy has a warm smile, he's the crown prince. If the guy has sly eyes and soft steps, he's definitely the second prince. Looking at the young man's rough face, she confidently concluded that it was indeed the second prince in front of her. The brunette was angry at this strange list. So, is he now on all the maids' list of people to avoid? He got really angry and promised that he would teach them all a lesson so that they wouldn't spread any rumors about him. But that wasn't the end of the list. There was a third prince, one who always carried a sword and had a confident expression. Yuri Briel. He just happened to be nearby at that time and came to the screams to check if everything was okay. Over the past 5 years, Yuri has grown a lot. And not only physically, but also mentally. He came closer to the boys and asked his brother to leave the poor new girl alone. There wasn't much need for argument. 10 minutes later, he was strolling calmly through the castle courtyard. He only laughed a little at his brother for always making fun of the maids and drove him away from the frightened girl. And as a sign of gratitude, she treated him to freshly baked cookies. Yuri enjoyed them quite a bit on the way because the cookies turned out to be really tasty. After having a snack, Yuri decided to take advantage of the free moment and check his mana reserves. He recently tried using mana while holding a sword to reduce the strain on his arms, and it worked. So gradually, he began to practice this method. Just think, he had already come so far in understanding his powers. It's been 5 whole years since his death at the hands of Roland, and the same amount of time has passed since he woke up in his cozy bed, realizing that he had regressed. The peaceful days that Yuri could have spent on self-improvement and preparing for possible dangers are already ending. The Council of Elders, as the boy had guessed, was just discussing the kingdom's latest problems. As he approached the door of the negotiating room, he heard loud shouts. The counts were on edge and couldn't get their positions across. Yuri tried to knock on the door several times in a row to be allowed in, but no matter how loudly he did it, there was no answer. The guard told the irritated prince that they must be too busy arguing to hear him knock. But Yuri wasn't going to wait for them to finally fall silent, so he simply knocked down the door with his mana-fortified hand. The counts opened their mouths wide in surprise when they saw Yuri. Yuri frivolously apologized and said that he probably knocked too hard because someone didn't hear him knock. The king closed his eyes and sighed heavily. He was already accustomed to such antics from his son. Yuri told him that he would like to join the discussion and he did not object, so they brought the guy a chair and placed it next to the table. One of the counts continued his speech and said that they did not have enough men to help the allied forces. The second one yelled at him and said they simply couldn't ignore the Empire's request for help. In that case, another house could send more men. Yuri frowned at them. As always, they were arguing, trying to gain their own advantage. The story unfolds exactly as Yuri remembered it from his past life. It happened around this time, a request to reinforce the Empire's allied forces. The Empire has requested personnel from various countries, and she sent them to the east to exterminate the orcs living there. But the plan failed and enraged orcs began crossing the borders of neighboring countries. All but the Empire. Then Briol realized that this was the Empire's plan. Because of this, they lost many great knights, including Leon Flander, who was also present at the meeting. However, now Yuri, identified in the Empire's plans, will not allow this to happen. The counts argued a lot about whether or not they should send their troops to help the Empire, citing various arguments, until suddenly Yuri stood up and announced that he would personally lead the squad to extermination. He will join the allied forces. They must do something to ensure that no one can tarnish Briol's name. Yuri asked them to do what nobles are supposed to do. The proud father looked at his grown son with a smile. I wonder what he was planning. After the meeting, Yuri went to training. He still sparred regularly with Bernard, but today, his older brother unexpectedly decided to drop in on him during training. He asked him if the boy was really planning to join the allied forces. Yuri replied that he was. Then his brother asked him why. Members of the royal family don't have to do that. But, as Yuri always said, it is still the duty of the royal family. The boy sighed heavily. Now he understood what was going on in the younger man's head. He enthusiastically promised to protect the palace during the younger one's absence and asked him to return alive from the campaign. And after that, he ran away as quietly and suddenly as he had run into the arena. Bernard said with a smile that the Briol family members have a wonderful brotherhood. Yuri asked the coach if he himself wasn't worried about his student. The man believed that the boy would return safe and sound if he didn't get into trouble. And yet, he also asked him to be more careful on the hike and not let himself get into danger if possible. Orcs are hard to deal with. They're far more powerful and bloodthirsty than you might imagine, especially those orcs who have a red flag visible behind their backs. People called them orcivals. They are especially fierce and bloodthirsty. Yuri convinced the coach that there was nothing to worry about. He would definitely cope, no matter what happened. And at that moment, another person suddenly ran out into the arena. Ina. She reported that a guest had arrived with the items Yuri had requested for his journey. Yuri smiled and informed the elder that he had a plan, so there was no need to worry about him. And this plan is very special, so it's better to trust Yuri and not ask questions. After training, Yuri went up to the hall in the palace where that special guest was waiting for him. It was Vice Guild Master Ilian. Guillermo. Yuri sat down next to him and asked how his old friend was doing. The man said that she was currently on a trip, so the representative came in her place. Yuri advised the woman to hire a cab, but she still travels with the goods herself because she prefers it that way. He came to the palace because they had obtained the items that Yuri had requested. Yuri took the proffered box and broke into a satisfied smile. Finally, he had it. The Sword of the Four Paths. He had been waiting a long time for this rare commodity to finally be delivered to him. Guillermo asked the young man if the item was truly so valuable. To him, it looked more like a set of decorative daggers. But then Yuri demonstrated their true value, as it was an artifact containing ancient magic. Guillermo recoiled in fear as he saw the sword rise into the air on its own and fly across the room. Yuri assured him everything was safe. The daggers wouldn't hurt him. Guillermo asked if Yuri moved the swords with mana. The boy confirmed, and the elder calmed down a bit. He hadn't thought His Highness had become so strong. Suddenly, Yuri felt something strange, but when the man asked if everything was okay, he answered that yes. Yuri asked him to convey his gratitude to Ilian for the goods. He also asked her to report on the progress of the Empire's branch at their next meeting. After this, Guillermo bowed and left the room. Yuri sighed wearily and told someone she could leave. A tall girl in a mask immediately appeared behind him, who was none other than Asana. Now she had become his personal spy. Yuri asked her what was going on with Goryo. The girl said that, in accordance with the guy's orders, she gave him a warning. She left a note on the headboard of his bed while he was sleeping that read, "Don't contact us." Yuri praised her for her good work. That swindler still tries to get his hands on Ilian's money every chance he gets. The girl, like everyone else in the palace, learned that the prince was joining the allied forces. She warned him to be careful. Yuri closed his eyes. The girl was telling him this as if it didn't concern her. Asuna smiled and took the hint. She jokingly remarked that the prince couldn't leave her alone and didn't want to leave her. But whatever she had to do, it was better this way than her previous life. So they agreed that Yuri would contact her later, and she would join the squad. A few days later, the day of departure arrived. Cedric saw him off on his journey. He was the last one to tell Yuri to be careful and ask him to take care of himself. He was very proud of his little brother, but he was also very worried about his safety. Yuri told him not to worry. He was, after all, invincible. So this expedition would raise Briol's reputation to the skies, and he asked his brother to at least take a little break from studying and take care of his eyes, because he was already constantly wearing glasses. Cedric gave his little brother a final hug and sincerely wished him luck in battle. Yuri promised to return. Soon, the servant blew his horn, attracting the attention of everyone gathered in the main courtyard. The king majestically announced the beginning of the departure ceremony. The third prince of Briol, the commander of the upcoming journey, ascended the platform to him. When he approached his father asked him if the boy was nervous. But Yuri confidently replied that he wasn't at all. The father nodded approvingly and asked his son to look behind him. Before him stood a huge detachment of soldiers, which at first glance seemed to have no end. Father said that all the soldiers that Yuri sees are precious lives that lie on his shoulders. Not everyone will be able to return home alive, but Yuri will try to ensure that they are not doomed to a miserable death, as in the past. And so, inopportunely, at such a crucial moment, Yuri was again overcome by that same murderous, anxious feeling. The world around him went dark. All Yuri saw before him was a blurry, fiery silhouette of a man glaring at him. Moreover, his body felt as if it were bound in chains. He couldn't move a single muscle. Yuri didn't know what exactly was standing in front of him, but he instinctively felt that it was death itself coming towards him. He accepted it and didn't move. If he tried to avoid her, he would die anyway. Does this mean there's no way to avoid it? This deadly aura will attack and leave no chance? Yuri felt the power and realized that things weren't so one-sided. And at that moment, Yuri was finally able to move. He charged his body with mana and drew his sharp sword from its sheath. Suddenly, the fog around him cleared and he saw his father in front of him, who suddenly tried to attack him, but Yuri deftly managed to block the blow. The father smiled contentedly and laughed. His son had done well. This was instead of parting words from his father. He was testing his son's reaction time. The father put the sword back and said that he couldn't tell him anything more motivating. Let him come back alive. Yuri thanked him and then stepped forward in front of his knights and promised, as the third prince of Briol, to lead them bravely. He hopes that they will believe in him and support him in everything, and he will definitely reciprocate. And then they will be able to defeat everyone, because they are the great army of Briol. Meanwhile, in the dungeon at the other end of the kingdom, in a cold, dark dungeon, a huge, terrifying orc was imprisoned. Sir Saindor looked at him carefully and thought that finally, after 5 years, he would be able to see the third prince again. Yuri's detachment set out early in the morning, and by evening they had already covered a considerable distance. At sunset, the warriors decided to make a short rest stop. Yuri consulted with his comrade about where they were now, and he said that they were already at the entrance to Saindor. If they walk a little further, they will be in the border town of Saindora. After this, they will pass through Gid and head to the assembly point at Balshad. Yuri was pleased with this. They were making fairly rapid progress. In the middle of Yuri and Raymond's conversation, the prince was suddenly called by an unfamiliar voice, although maybe not completely unfamiliar. Yuri knows him. He just heard him a long time ago, even in a past life. It was Roland Flandre, the very man who had killed him in his past life, the Margrave's eldest son. But instead of the unpleasant meeting the boy expected, something else happened. Roland knelt down in front of the prince and said that he was very glad to meet him. He said that even before the meeting, he wanted to confess something to His Highness. Yuri became worried again, preparing himself for any not-so-good outcome, because he could not at all imagine what Roland might say to him. But then Roland's eyes suddenly lit up. He looked at the prince adoringly and said that he admired him very much. After the incident he learned about from his father 5 years ago, the third prince became his idol. He was greatly impressed by the way Yuri raised his sword to protect the maid. He was a living example of a true knight incarnate. Yuri patted the guy on the shoulder and said that he also knew something about Roland from his father, so he wouldn't mind getting along. Roland returned happily to his horse, and Raymond said that it was time for them to move on further. Before leaving, he told Yuri that Duke Sindor wasn't known for being the kindest or most hospitable man, so his unfriendliness shouldn't be taken to heart. When the sun had almost set below the horizon, they reached the estate of Count Sindor. And what was the surprise of Yuri and his squad when they saw that a team of knights was meeting them at the entrance, and there was also a huge welcoming banner on the gate. Yuri chuckled and said the reception was quite warm, so he was pleased. Roland's jaw nearly dropped. He'd never seen anything like it. Sindor Heim. Theodore himself came out with his knights to greet the third prince. He wanted to show respect to someone who, at such a young age, was already going to fight on the front lines. Sir Sindor asked the boy if he had ever fought orcs before. The guy would like to proudly answer that he has a similar experience. But in reality, not only had he never fought them, he'd never even seen one in person. He'd only read about them in books. Sir Sindor wasn't surprised. Most of the soldiers in their company had never fought orcs, so he took it upon himself to at least train them all. Yuri dismounted from his horse and walked closer to Margrave Sindor. The man asked the prince's permission to give him something as a gift, since it was such an occasion. He led Yuri and his squad to his dungeon, which was located under the castle. The servant took a key from his pocket and turned it in the heavy, strong lock. Sir Sindor walked in front, holding a torch in his hand, and all the others followed him. The man pointed straight ahead and said that His Highness's gift was in this room. Yuri and the closest members of his squad, together with the Margrave, went inside the chamber. Suddenly he took and slammed the door behind the Knights of Briolle. Yuri frowned and asked the Margrave what he was doing with them. The man smiled slyly and told them not to be so surprised. He was acting in their best interests. They walked deeper into the dungeon, and the man slowly lit the floor lanterns around the perimeter. Only then did the squad finally notice that in the far part of the room, there was a cage in which a real orc was imprisoned. Heim explained that he needed to study his species to survive, everything from their minor habits to their instincts. Yuri asked if this was the gift Sir Heim had told him about. He confirmed. Considering that a battle with them lay ahead, a more valuable gift couldn't be imagined. The boy was convinced that the Margrave was even crazier than he thought. But on the other hand, he was even pleased with the opportunity. Yuri noticed that one of his warriors was standing next to him, who was trembling with fear. The prince asked his name, and he replied that he was Simon Reishu, the son of Baron Wolf. Then Yuri asked him to answer honestly what was on his mind right now. Simon thought he shouldn't have gone that far. To mock an orc like that was too much, even for a prisoner of war. Yuri understood perfectly well why the boy was thinking that way. But he also knew that the boy would quickly change his mind in a fight with him. The prince asked the Margrave to open the cage and release the orc. The orc obediently complied. While the gates were rising, Yuri decided to say one last thing to the young man. The orc stamped his heavy foot angrily. Yuri announced that a real fight was about to begin, and none other than Simon must fight him in order to understand what the prince is talking about. The rest of the squad retreated back, and the young knight stood up to fight the monster one-on-one. But instead of attacking, the orc, as soon as he was free, fell to his knees and began banging his head on the floor. Simon was confused and lowered his sword. Was it really that bad? He turned to Yuri and said that, as he thought, it was simply absurd to fight a prisoner who had lost the will to fight. But his conclusions were hasty, because as soon as he turned his back to the monster, he was immediately knocked out with a strong blow to the head. The orc dented the boy's iron helmet so hard that Simon's ears began ringing. After that, the evil monster grabbed the boy and, holding him close, squeezed his throat. One careless move, and he could easily break his neck. Sir Heim calmed the frightened knights and said that they had cut most of his tendons, so it would not be difficult to defeat him. Now both Yuri and the members of his squad finally realized what orcs really are.